We were waiting for Stuart and Kai, but since you walked in, I figured that's a good time.
Yeah, let's give him a hard time when he walks in.
Okay. So let's call this meeting to order. The September 12th meeting. It feels like it's been forever since we've all been together. We have a new member, Greg. Greg, if you don't mind.
My name is Greg Sadowski. Happy to be here. First, I want to thank staff for really taking time to meet with me, to enlighten me on what you do and on a lot of the issues. So that was very nice, and thank you for your time. And excited to be here.
Did they tell you about the exam?
Yes, and they said you have 2 years to study for it.
Can you share with us a little bit about your background, Greg?
Sure. My background, I've been in the real estate business for 35 years as a broker, owner, on the commercial side, and worked in the public REIT environment for the last, for about over 20 years. And I somewhat semi-retired, and then I'm a consultant now, helping individuals with some of their real estate issues, and found time to maybe give back a little. And this is something that seemed very interesting, and happy to be here.
All right, on to item number 1. We have the approval of the meeting minutes from July, I believe. Yes.
I have read them and I didn't see anything wrong with them. I move approval.
Okay.
All those, yes, we did.
Oh, okay.
All those in favor of approval? Everybody, all right. Item number 2, public comment, communications, member comments. Do we have anybody from the public wishing to speak? No. Anybody on the committee have any? All right. Move on to item number 3. It's a consent item. It's the quarterly progress report on Transit Major Corridor and Regional Byway Program projects. Does anybody have any questions or reasons to pull this off consent?
I have a question of staff. Maybe Jim's over here. It's the tariff issue, the steel tariffs. I'm understanding from the industry that the increase in costs is pretty big, and the city of San Diego we were given a report from the city as well. So any news on you're seeing on the tariff issue?
Yeah,
the impact?
Part of it is good timing for us because we are under construction with all of our major projects. The last major project we let was last winter at Poinsettia for double tracking and station work up there. And so all of the contracts that we have, especially the Mid-Coast contracts, that's already been negotiated. So we're not seeing impacts yet. Some of the contracts we're letting in the future are smaller bicycle jobs, but as the tariffs stick, I'm sure there'll be we'll not only see that impact in some of our future larger jobs, but also the ripple effect with other suppliers and things like that.
Just to continue on, do we know if any of our contractors did not fix pricing their steel when they entered the contract, that they're at risk now and they might be suffering?
I don't know that, but if they were at great risk, I probably would have heard. So the fact that I didn't hear makes me think that they're not.
And can you explain, because I have trouble following the newspapers, what tariffs on, what's off, what's on that whole steel been implemented? Steel and aluminum been implemented?
Yes, I believe so.
Steel.
I know the industry would know best.
Steel.
Across all countries, or some exempted?
I'm not sure.
I mean, you need a scorecard to keep track of this.
Once again, we already buy our products in the U.S.
Your goal.
Yeah, but the tariffs will make those domestic prices, there'll be a natural push to push them up. But so far, because of our much of our construction program was let over the past couple of years, we're good so far.
But if there are increases, the contractor, will the contractors get reimbursed on that if they do
There's
go
no
up?
contractual provision for that, no.
That's the issue that's coming.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
but you haven't heard at this point the contractors are
Correct.
coming to you.
I have not.
Thank you.
Stuart? We're on item 3. Questions or anybody else have any questions? This is a non-action item, it's just informational. I don't think we need to vote or anything.
I had one question, just curiosity on the 2 miles of second tracking. What is additional 2 miles of second tracking accomplish in the big picture? Is this just an interim step while funding is generated for more miles?
So I think this is in relation to Sorrento de Miramar double track phase 2. So for this project specifically, the additional 2 miles will lead to 13 miles of continuous double track in that region. So a small portion that will create bigger continuity along that area.
This 2 is the last 2 of the 13.
Yes, to complete that.
Yeah, the goal for that entire corridor, so the Coastal Rail Corridor, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Luis Obispo Corridor, in our area, a significant portion of it was single track when we first started. I forget, we're up to
Almost 3/4,
Yeah.
we started off 50%.
50%, and so the goal really is to double track the large portion of it. There may be some areas, like the bluffs and others, that we may not be able to double track right away, but the goal is to double track, and what that does is actually allows you to run more service, or allows the trains. Right now, with the single track section, sometimes if your train's coming together, someone has to wait while the other ones pass. Yes. You hope, yeah. While they pass, and so that, that extends schedules, and so we're trying to basically bring more trains, have them, shorter duration from point A to point B. So that's the ultimate goal.
And the ultimate goal is to get to 100%.
Yeah, yeah.
Allows for
We're
additional
near
stops
there.
too.
Pardon?
Allows for potential additional stops as well.
Yes, yes.
All right, so with that, move on to item number 4, Ariana, with a summary of.
Yeah, we have quite a few updates since your last meeting, which was in July. It feels like it's been a while. So July 13th, there was a board policy meeting, and our own Italk member Stuart Halpern introduced, and also your performance auditors presented the performance audit to the board. That included a discussion on progress to date against ordinance goals. You'll recall Sandag recently established an audit committee, and they had their first meeting in July, and they've also requested that we present an overview of the audits that Italk conducts, so Lisa and I will be presenting that in October. The Plan of Excellence, which is on your agenda today, that was presented at the July board meeting as well. Our TIP amendment number 14 was adopted at the Transportation Committee in July, and you reviewed that in July as well. And then the draft 2018 RTIP was recommended by the Transportation Committee, and the board accepted that. And today you're going to be hearing about the proposed final RTIP. The Transportation Committee recommended and the board approved the evaluation criteria and the call for projects for the Specialized Transportation Grant Program, which includes your senior mini grant program. The board approved the funding recommendations for Cycle 9 of the EMP Land Management Program, as well as funding recommendations for the Smart Growth and Active Transportation Grant Programs. And they also recommended and the board approved the proposed look-ahead implementation plan for the 10-year review. You remember that you provided a set of recommendations for that, and so the look-ahead includes those. The Transportation Committee reviewed an update on the transit operations funding, and you'll recall that you saw that at a meeting earlier this year. And then also at the July meeting of the board, our Italk chair, Dustin Fuller, presented your 2018 annual report. The Italk Selection Committee, as was mentioned earlier, appointed Greg Sadowski to the Italk, so welcome. And then this Friday, the board is anticipated to take action on the terms and conditions of the executive director position, and we anticipate an announcement at some point after that. And then last but not least, our other committees have iPads, so during the meetings they use iPads. And so that is an option that is available to this committee as well. So maybe what we'll do is just send out a brief survey, if that's okay with everybody, and hear your thoughts on that.
How would that Or you would just have them here when we got here, and they'd have the materials, and we'd use them during the meeting and then leave them?
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
and
Just to not have like interpaper?
or we could leave the option for those members, you know, because some of the items that you review are, you know, kind of, you know, larger spreadsheets with smaller font, and we could, you know, we could work it out that way as well. But yeah, we would have our IT members present maybe at your October meeting and provide just a brief overview of how to use those, how to navigate, and what that would look like.
We discussed this briefly on the phone the other day, and I currently have two iPads for two different boards, but the ones you take with you. And the big difference is when you have it at home, you can put notes on it. If you just come in here, you have no notes from any of your reading, so that's something to consider. And the other thing, as you mentioned, the font size, the stuff you guys produce. I don't know how you do it, particularly if they're the old smaller iPads, not the new big ones. Tough, but
They're like this way.
if you have them, we can experiment with them.
Yeah.
This is what
Pick
we
up one
got.
of the spreadsheets.
But you can go like this and
Keep track of that, that's pretty good.
On the point six rate, is there like a user experience group that is, you know, constantly takes in feedback and tries to implement, you know, upgrades for that program? Or
What we've done is we've been, in the name of sustainability, over this last actually several years, we've been trying to transition away from paper to the extent possible. So our boards and committees, for the most part, we don't send out, I mean, we used to have every Friday, people in the mail room stuffing envelopes. We're not doing that anymore. We're emailing a PDF of the agenda and all the supporting material. We have, I want to say, less than a handful of board members that actually still, they want paper, we send them a packet and stuff. For the most part, at least our committee and board members have transitioned. Some of them have their own iPad, and so what I do is I just download it and I use Adobe Acrobat and take, and do so there's that option. Well, others, you know, are comfortable kind of, many of them own their own, you know, either laptops or computers, are kind of comfortable that way. So it's really up to you. I mean, that's kind of our goal to transition to paperless. It really, but I want to make sure you're able to kind of do the work you need to do, because sometimes people are just more comfortable making notes on paper and bringing it. But if you're comfortable in an electronic environment and use your iPad enough, and you know, there's definitely programs that you can mark up and have your notes come with.
There is a program that will absorb your input to us that'll go in where we have the note-taking capability, like Director's Desk is what I use.
Oh yeah, I mean, I use Adobe Acrobat or Adobe Reader or something.
We could look into it.
Adobe products.
See what we find out.
You could have an educational session for us, maybe that's what
Yeah.
Stuart's driving at.
well, also just in terms of the manner in which the document is, and so notes might be one part of it, but just, and maybe I wasn't trained because it was just like at the audit committee,
Right.
somebody said, here it is. But it appeared as if the document, and you know, these packages can be, you know, several hundred
Right.
pages, as you've seen. They're not tabbable, so you kind of have to scroll through
Oh.
every page, but maybe I just didn't learn how to do that.
Yeah, there's a way to.
Okay, all right, well, I don't want to take time here.
I'm not the
Okay,
best,
cool.
but we can have somebody here who.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.
If there's a way to put notes on it and tabbable them, I
We will
would
ask.
prefer
Okay.
paper.
Okay.
But I think leave it up to, if you can open it up to individuals' choices, still have some available via paper if they want it.
If you could schedule a splinter session maybe where you can demonstrate how you use yours,
Sure.
what tools you use to be able to make notes and such.
Right.
Getting rid of all this paper that you plus on.
Yeah.
Are you going to ask us individually if we want paperless?
I can
Or
do
you
that.
will do a survey.
Yes. I'll
When
send
will
out
that
a,
request come?
I'll send you an email this week. Does that sound good?
With everybody?
Everybody, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
So the item Friday with the terms and conditions means with a specific individual that are being recommended up the ladder.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, there'll be a closed session item where the board will discuss, and then we actually have an open session item that has the terms and conditions. So assuming the board, you know, approves and moves forward, we will be announcing, our chair will be announcing the name of the individual. So we do expect it in the next couple days. So stay tuned.
It's really close.
None of us got the job, I
Is that all? I mean, not, is that all?
Is that all?
Okay.
A lot.
So now we're on to item number 5. This is recommend we vote on this Transnet Smart Growth Incentive Program and Active Transportation Grant Program. Status update and amendment requests. Tracy?
Thank you, Chair Fuller. And welcome, Greg. Mr. Steve. So as you know, sandag staff provides quarterly progress reports for the Transnet Smart Growth Incentive Program and the Active Transportation Grant Program projects. Since these two programs were launched, more than $50 million in Transnet funding has been awarded to over 100 smart growth and active transportation projects, leveraging over $34 million in local funding for a total investment in the San Diego region of $80 million. In my report today, I'm happy to include our Cycle 4 call for projects, which was released in December of this year. We got applications in March. Once all projects are awarded, this will add another $30 million in awards and leveraging another approximately $16 million in local match. Projects funded with these programs often serve to catalyze the revitalization of business districts in the downtown areas and help improve the overall health, bike and pedestrian safety, and quality of life in our communities. The purpose of my staff report today is to provide information on the quarterly status of the Smart Growth and Active Transportation and the Exchange projects for the period of January through March 31st, 2018. Since the last reporting through December 31st of 2017, one Smart Growth project has been completed. That's the City of National City Downtown West Side Wayfinding and Communities Gateway project. As of March 31st, 2017, all projects are on schedule, except for one Smart Growth project, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. Attachment 1 of the staff report provides the status of the Smart Growth and Active Transportation projects currently underway, as well as those projects that have been completed or withdrawn in the current cycle. So during this quarter, one Smart Growth, as I mentioned, one Smart Growth Incentive Program project was completed, and one Smart Growth project is asking for your amendment today, schedule amendment. And I have Kathleen Brand here from Civic San Diego to answer any questions that you may have. Other than that, this concludes my report.
I have a question, and it's just basically for my general education, and I'm sure I've had this explained before, but it didn't stick. Civic San Diego is somewhat unique, and I'm trying to understand their uniqueness relative to all your other projects. They're a municipality, a government agency, the government itself.
Yeah, Civic San Diego, the actual, the projects are only awarded to the 18 cities and jurisdictions. Civic San Diego is an alternate pay of City of San Diego. So City of San Diego is actually the grantee for this project. Yes.
And then they just, in essence, subcontract.
Yeah.
Technically to San Diego.
Civic San Diego is a nonprofit organization owned by the City of San Diego. So we are a subset. We are not technically the city, but we are a subset. And through our operation agreement with the city, we're allowed to apply for these grants with the city's approval. So everything that we do goes through the city first. So when we apply for a sandag grant, we go with the city as if we're another department and say we're going for this grant, this is how we want to apply it, and then we get approval to do so on behalf of the city.
If I understand it correctly, you effectively function as another department of the city.
Yes.
I was just curious whether there was a difference in overhead absorption of this other unique nonprofit department of the city versus the national cities department that would handle these kind of projects?
I don't believe there's any difference with our overhead. We don't charge overhead on our grants.
Yeah, they don't charge indirect costs on their grant.
They do not. So all the money in these grants goes for what I call product, nothing for
Yeah.
their agency's cost.
We do pay the staff salary. Staff salary is an eligible cost in our grants. So it's just for staff salary that's actually working on our project. It's not to pay any one individual salary. It's just the hours that they're working on our project.
It's a direct cost.
It's a direct cost. Exactly.
Are there any other relationships like that with any other jurisdictions, or is it just Civic?
Civic is the only alternate payee that I know of right now.
I'm sure there's a long history of discussion of why this was necessary.
Mr. Chair? I have one very quick question. But first of all, I've read Civic San Diego's letter, and we all understand construction, and I believe we should recommend the extension, and I would so move. But my quick question, we see an awful lot of project lists, and you always have a watch list. And why isn't this project on the watch list? You say no.
Yes, one of the reasons why a project would be on the watch list is if they are in trouble of not reaching a milestone and have not contacted us. And in this instance, Civic contacted us already, so they're not on the watch list.
All right, thank you. So we understand that. I move that we recommend approval.
Second.
Any other discussion or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor? Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go a little bit out of order. Ariana informed me that Sarah needs to move up, so we're going to move item number 11 now. This is EMP.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our new member. Thanks for being flexible with the schedule. I have a call I need to jump on to. So most of you know that the Land Management Grant Program provides funding to assist land managers with projects on conserved lands in our region. Those are kind of signage and fencing projects, removal of invasive species, or kind of other habitat restoration work. And since the program's inception, we've funded 117 projects that total about $16.5 million. And that includes the 19 projects that were just recommended by the Board of Directors in July. So the purpose of this report is just to provide you an update on the quarterly status of those active grants that we have at the moment. 2 projects were completed during the April 1st through June 30th reporting period. The Proctor Valley Off-Highway Vehicle Barrier Project by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Bernardo Bay Cactus Run Project by the City of San Diego. Attachment 1, which is on pages 4 to 6 of your report, provides the status of the 20 active land management grants that we currently have, and all of those projects are currently in good standing with no projects on the watch list. So that concludes my report, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about the program or the projects that are ongoing.
Just for me, the MOA, is there an update to that? I read through this,
Yes.
I didn't see it said we have a new one. Or
It's coming. I believe it should be coming to the different committees and to the board this fall. So,
oh, great. All the same players, everybody signed back up?
yes, all the same players involved in those discussions, and as far as I know, as you know, Keith kind of manages that, but I believe it's on track and going okay.
Excellent. Any questions?
Sarah, just a quick question. When does the 10 years end? Is that after the amendment in 2013?
Yeah, so the 10 years is actually, we're right on that mark right now, and so Chair Fuller's question about renewing that MOA, we're working on it right now to get it signed as quickly as possible and to renew it.
And then on $4 million annually, is that, what's the history of that? Is that, are you getting to about 4 million a year?
Yeah, so in that 10-year period, every year $4 million has been allocated to the Habitat Conservation Fund, which is kind of a subset of our EMP. And a portion of that money each year goes into the grant funding pot. And so then when we get enough money in that grant funding pot, we come out to our call for projects, and we've done 9 of those successfully over the last 10 years. So it's been moving pretty quickly.
It's good news. Thank you.
I have a sort of a more basic question. This is just to refresh my own understanding of some of the basics here. In awarding the grants, there's a sort of definition of what's eligible for grants, and then you sort of get grants, and according to the selection criteria, you pick them. The thing I'm curious about is that isn't obvious in looking at the number of grants that are or projects that are underway is within the range of things that are eligible. Are there things that we've listed as needs, priorities, interests for which we just haven't had people respond, so that there are some things in the portfolio of needs that we actually aren't addressing because prospective grantees just haven't shown up to handle those things?
Yeah, that's a really great question. One of the things that helps guide the selection of who gets funding is how this ties back to our management strategic plan, which is kind of a plan for the San Diego region, which decides kind of which of our critters and which of our plants are in danger and how we can help them moving forward. And so when our grantees come to apply for these grants, they have to link back to those objectives. And that's what helps them score pretty well in these grant programs going forward. Now, there could always be more money and there could always be more species that we could help, but I think by defining those objectives up front, we've done a pretty good job putting the money where it really needs to go. So to my knowledge, nothing has kind of stood out that we've said, oh, we really need a project to focus on this, and we haven't necessarily gotten that funding.
Okay, cool.
So they seem to be lining up pretty well.
And that was something as part of your training performance audits that was raised with the EMP program from Gilbert Evershank, like early on.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot of kudos given to the program, how it's run, but it did raise, I forget, on one of the ordinances, just that. How do you know that you're prioritizing the right things? And so that's one of the reasons why the strategic management plan was done. It was in process, but that's a core reason of why that was done. So it really kind of shows where, as you've taken a look at the transit program holistically, we've made changes and improved over the years.
Just, I can follow up, just my understanding. I know you've have developed some very elaborate scoring sheets and so on and so forth, but my question is, you also have a separate process that kind of prioritizes needs. Hypothetically, you have top prioritized need, and you have a proposal down here that scores tremendously well on a lower prioritized need. Do they win and this doesn't?
It all kind of depends how the points shake out. So there's more points allocated, so to speak, for how you're tying into those objectives to that strategic plan. So you kind of get more money. But then there's other things that you'd be scored on that you may score well on or score not so great on. And so how those points all shake out in the end is determined.
Priorities get they're overlaid in the weighting systems. So
yes.
Hypothetical couldn't happen. If a person is only marginally responsive, but it's your highest priority, and that's the only proposal, they can outweigh one of the proposals down here to a lower priority.
Potentially, yeah. It all depends how they're scored, and then of course we have 8 people scoring, and that all gets kind of mixed together. But
it's designed to cope with that problem.
yes,
yeah. And you can take a look too to see how the grants have been in relation to the higher priorities in the strategic plan. I mean, that's something we can definitely take a look at.
And that's the core of my question. Is when you go through this all, does it just
end
happen?
up in the wash? Yeah.
That's something that we really would like to see get done, hasn't been addressed because of, not because of, any intent or just the way it shaked out of the score.
Right.
And maybe just one last thing to mention there is a little bit of flexibility in terms of how the folks allocate the funding to the program. You might remember in the last call for projects, we had 5 projects or 6 projects that were allocated funding in what we call kind of the large grant category. Many of them only got a portion of funding because all of them were kind of hitting on objectives, and we wanted to give some money to help with all those really high priority objectives. We partially awarded quite a few projects so that we made sure that we were kind of feeding into those high priority projects that we wanted to at least get off the ground and kind of get running.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Sarah. Enjoy your call.
Thank you.
Okay. Item number 6, the Plan of Excellence implementation. We got an army of folks.
Well, the teams getting to that, we just want to mention, I think we had made a presentation, Ray had on the data plan for data accuracy and modeling. That really has been sort of incorporated under this plan of excellence. Our board last November really adopted this plan of excellence, which our team here is going to walk you through. It looked like things like the data point accuracy plan, things that came out of the recommendations that came out in the independent investigation on Measure A, items, recommendations we saw through the Italk with your performance reviews and whatnot, and things like the Taxpayer Association have made a bunch of recommendations on how we can better communicate. So we've taken a look at that, taken a look at our own kind of processes across the agency, and how we can do better. And it's sort of all encapsulated under this plan of excellence. So we made a report back to the board, as Ariana mentioned, this past summer. I think Stuart had asked for this, so you're going to actually see this probably a couple more times. And so the teams here, these are all our directors that really have sort of the management responsibility for at least some major section of the plan. So I think you'll enjoy this in terms of kind of the breadth of what we're doing and how it sort of touches the agency as a whole. Melissa's kicking it off.
So good morning, and thank you for inviting the presentation on the Plan of Excellence. We are looking forward to sharing with you the work that staff has been undertaking with regards to this initiative. So as Kim mentioned, the Plan of Excellence is a sandag board initiative, and it is being led by our chair, Terry Sandag. The background is, toward the end of last year, sandag had received a number of recommendations, suggestions, even requirements of changes that we needed to implement in the organization. I think Kim alluded to the fact that some of these were in response to the AB 805 legislation. Others were recommendations that either came in from internal or external sources, such as the 7-point data accuracy plan that Ray had brought forward, the San Diego Taxpayers Association, some of the recommendations that we'd heard from board members and policy advisory committee members and so forth. I'm sorry, the one other item I wanted to mention was the Measure A investigation report that also was completed last year, and there were recommendations in that report as well for sandag to take a look at. Looking at all of those recommendations and requirements that came in, we identified 35 different action items that needed to be responded to and addressed. And so the Plan of Excellence takes those 35 action items. It has categorized those into 8, organized those into 8 categories, which is what you're seeing in our Plan of Excellence wheel here. Those categories, as you can see from the titles, include technical program areas, such as data accuracy and regional forecasting, but there's also some policy oversight functions in there, as well as communication strategies. So as you'll hear when the directors present in a few minutes, the changes and improvements that are being implemented as part of the Plan of Excellence are not one-time items, not one-time actions. Staff has really taken the time to consider how to respond to the various recommendations that were received and implement new business practices that become integrated into the way that we do business and really lead to effective organization change. So now, next slide here is really being developed to show the overall timeline for the Plan of Excellence. And what I'd like to also do is reference you to a document that I believe is at your places. We call it our Plan of Excellence Progress at a Glance chart. So what this does is it describes each of the 35 action items that make up the Plan of Excellence. They're organized into their 8 categories. And this chart also will show the current status of those action items. The fully shaded circle indicates that an item has been fully implemented. The half shaded circles indicate an item that is underway, and of course the open circle is an item that is yet to be addressed. The chart here is intended to indicate that as of August more than half of the items in the plan have been completed. Those remaining items will be addressed by staff in the coming months, and we intend to provide another update to the board in December this year with those additional updates. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to the directors here to describe some of the work that staff has undertaken. And first off is Ray Major. Again.
Thank you. I've spoken to you several times about the 7-point plan, which was really a departmental effort to take a look at what we could do to improve our processes, especially how they related to the way that we handle data. We did forecasting and that type of thing. And I'm very proud that 2 of the things that we worked on, we got into the Plan of Excellence, because I think from an agency-wide perspective, these are key. And so the first one is really data governance. And what we discovered as we were going through the 7-point plan is that really the control of data and the oversight of data is really an agency issue. It wasn't just a departmental issue. It was something that we needed to put, we needed to spend more time on agency-wide to make sure that we had everything from accurate data, but also that the data was backed up on a regular schedule, that we had product specifications, that we had QA of the data, that we had processes that were transparent, so if anyone wanted to look at how or why we came up with the decisions we had, that we would take those into consideration. And so all of these efforts have been undertaken in the last year, and we've done a tremendous amount of things to improve our data accuracy, and a lot of that includes having things which are called these peer reviews that I think I talked to you about the last time. And we have any decision that's made, for instance, when it comes to a data or modeling, whether it's in our group or in other groups, like for instance the planning group, we sit down with a set of peers. It could be anywhere from an internal group to including external experts. So we've had these where we've had just a few people internally look at data, depending on what it is, to when we looked at the forecast, for instance, we brought in 10 PhD experts from around the nation. We flew them in for a day to go over our forecast and really give us feedback on what the models were producing and whether or not they were correct. So we have now a transparent peer review process where we document this stuff, and it's all up on our network. If we get a public records request of how did you come up with this or what were the decisions made, it's all there. All the people who were included in the decision are all listed, and we now have governance of that type of data. The next thing was the regional growth forecast. And here really, we took a look at the forecasting tools that we used in order to produce the regional growth forecast and the era that we talked about and how that all happened. And DEFM was a very good model, or demographic, economic, and forecasting model. It served the region well for decades, but it had grown and it became a very big, sophisticated piece of software that was very difficult to maintain, and nobody really knew what was going on. So what we did was determine that we needed to create more simplified forecasting tools. And so we broke out the various components of the model depending upon the different uses of the model. So for instance, we need a long-term model when we talk about forecasting population in 2050 and what type of transportations we need. We need to feed in long-term information. So we have now a model that does that. There's also a demand, though, for understanding the economy short-term, so understanding what inflation rates are doing and what unemployment is doing and that type of stuff. So there's that component. So we have a separate short-term model now that works with the long-term model, but they're independent. DEFM would have had those tied together as one big model. And then, most importantly, we took out the sales tax model. And rather than having the sales tax model be a derivative of data within our model, which was like how much income people were going to earn in our model, what we did is we worked with a company called Muni Services, who is one of our consultants who understands tax collection at the point of sale for every single business in San Diego. And they can tell us exactly what's happening, how much each car dealership is collecting, how much each retailer is collecting. And so instead of doing a top-down apportionment, what we're doing is a bottom-up approach where we actually look at sales tax collected by each individual business and then we add that up and we do the forecast from that direction, and we have much better understanding of where the money's coming from. How much is being leaked because of things like Amazon, for instance, from retail sales and things like that, because we know what Amazon collects versus what they sell. So those are the things that we did. The other thing we did was to start to express these forecasts in ranges rather than give you a point forecast, so that way it talks about the inherent uncertainty of the models, and that we don't know exactly how much it is. So we've got now cones of uncertainty. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jose. We'll talk a little bit more about one of the models that we do.
So,
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just on the cones of range.
Like the hurricane cone.
In the past, when or more recently when you presented stuff showing the plus and minus, it was, and I don't mean this in a value-laden sense, it was kind of a simple plus or minus 5%. Where are you in terms of evolving that into something that is truly more of like a probabilistic kind of range?
So that's a great question. I mean, developing these cones is rather complex, because what happens is that these models feed each other. And so if, for instance, we have a cone on our population is the largest driver, for instance, for sales tax, the number of people we have that we're collecting from. So if we put a cone on that, then that impacts our sales tax revenue depending on if we come in low or high, so they kind of are additive. So it was a really large project, and instead of doing it, trying to do it all at one time, what we did is we started to put these ranges on, saying plus minus 5%. And what we're doing as we're moving forward is we're starting to look at historical data and variations. So you're most familiar with the sales tax model. So for instance, we have a point forecast, okay? And now what we're looking at for the bottom of the range is that we're taking a look at all of the recessions that have occurred while we've implemented Transnet, while we've had that. We're making a correction for the Great Recession because it was a little bit too deep, and we're saying, what would be the probability if we went into a recession? How low would our revenue go? How many millions of dollars? This is like 4 to 6% impact. So that now becomes the bottom of the cone. And then the top of the cone, we take a look at, for instance, what's happening in the current economy, where we're growing at 4.3% GDP. This is probably, this isn't sustainable, but it would give you an upper range saying if we keep growing like this, then we could have this much revenue. So we're starting to use data to predict our cones. We've also done regression analysis type of work when it comes to the cost models to figure out, for instance, like the cost of concrete and things like that, so down to the component level. But for each one of those, we have to write a model, and then some of them are so wide that it's very difficult to interpret. So we're still working through those, but as we go forward, what we're hoping to do is to create models that are more indicative of what the real variations are within those variables.
Great, thanks.
That's what we're doing.
So expanding on all the work that Ray is doing, which is really tied more to sort of the sales tax forecast and those kinds of things. The Transnet Department also develops forecasts for the state and the federal revenues that are used for long-range planning. So all of the forecasts in terms of revenues that are assumed as part of the 2050 regional plan, that's something that the Transnet Department does. And so we've also taken a page off of what Ray is doing in terms of going through a peer review process where we invite experts from outside agencies to take a look at our assumptions. Well, one of the things that we want to make sure of is that these are reasonable, and that's sort of the threshold that the state and the federal governments ask us in terms of doing these forecasts. We're also providing the forecast for these state and federal revenues in range format, and so this is really intended to better illustrate the uncertainty associated with the assumptions, but we also want to be transparent in terms of, we're not necessarily 100% sure that we're going to hit this point dollar amount, but there is a certain amount of uncertainty. And so when we do that, because we're dealing, the number of assumptions that are in the regional plan is about 3 different revenue sources that feed the entire regional plan. We take a look at some of the more long-established forecasts, and those we have a greater degree of certainty. For others, where we have greater degree of uncertainty, then those that sort of the plus or minus would be a wider cone. So all of those get added in, and you essentially end up with sort of like a composite range of certainty. We've also gone to come to this committee as well as to the board to talk about our assumptions so that there's better understanding in terms of what is it that we're doing, why is it that we're doing it, and also to listen to your concerns so that we can address those and incorporate those into the assumptions. So this is what we're doing in terms of the revenues. Looking at the costs, we're trying to bring more frequent project status updates to not just to this committee, but also the Transportation Committee, to the board, where it's not just a status update, but it's also a discussion about what are some of the risks that may impact either the cost or the schedule of delivering a particular project? What are the costs associated with those particular risks should they occur? And so these are some of the things that we're also trying to do in terms of bringing greater transparency in terms of the costs. What are the cost drivers in terms of whether, we talked about the steel tariffs earlier today, so that's something that may impact us later on in the future. But there's also, when we're talking about cost, there's also opportunities. So we've talked about implementing the accordion approach. So when revenues are less or costs are going up, we may need to kind of shrink the accordion. But there may be an opportunity when we can expand the accordion and do more projects. So these are the kinds of things that we're bringing to this committee as well as to the board. And then just to conclude, the plan of finance. This is something that we've brought to the Italk about on an annual basis. The last time that was brought to you was about a year ago. The board approved it in October of last year. And so we update it every year, essentially to make sure that we have the latest, greatest assumptions for revenues. It's not just Transnet, but there's also the supporting state and federal revenues for the Transnet program. And then we also want to make sure that we have the latest, greatest cost information. And so we provide that to the Italk as well as to the Transportation Committee and the board. This year, given the uncertainty associated with SB1 through Prop 6 that's on the November ballot, we anticipate bringing the plan of finance until after the vote so that we can incorporate whatever happens in November into the plan of finance. So with that, let me turn it over to John.
Thanks.
So with that,
Very much. Hi, I'm John Kirk. I serve as General Counsel here at Sandag, and our office has been involved primarily in two of the components of the Plan of Excellence. And the first of those relates to independent performance audits. So before I talk about those particular activities, let me mention a couple of things. One, the focus of this is performance audits, not financial audits. That's something that already has a pretty established structure. With performance audits, rather than looking at really the propriety of how dollars are spent, it really gets more into the effectiveness of the activities that underlie those expenditures to make sure that we're fulfilling those activities, doing them as effectively as we can, and identifying areas for improvement. The second thing I'll mention is that this is formalizing something that has pre-existed at Sandag for a long time. We have for a long time had an auditor who serves as in a performance audit function who has looked at a lot of Sandag's components of Sandag's mission, our activities, and has performed a number of performance audits taking a look at different areas and how we can improve performance in those areas. So in terms of the Plan of Excellence, how we've kind of formalized our commitment to improve in this area, the first thing that really happened there was the implementation of Board Policy 39. Board Policy 39 established the framework and the processes for a new policy advisory committee at Sandag, the Audit Committee. That the board approved that policy back last December, and now it's being implemented. One of the things that happened fulfilling that is the Audit Committee membership. We now have the Audit Committee fully it's filled. We have 3 citizen members and 2 electeds. It's our only policy advisory committee that has more non-electeds than electeds in it. And they have started meeting, and they have their next meeting is going to be this coming Friday. Probably their next big lift is going to be finding an independent performance auditor, someone to serve that role. They have already undertaken a recruitment effort for that, and I understand that their target to have somebody both hired and up and running in that role is March of next year, hopefully with them actually attending the April meeting and starting their functions at that point. Moving forward, the independent performance auditor will work with the audit committee to recommend adoption of internal control guidelines and to formalize that. And then continuing into the future, preparing an annual audit plan and a budget for consideration by the audit committee. And then as they identify areas to focus on, to periodically provide audit reports to the audit committee that will then go up to the board for consideration. Another area that we've been involved with has been records management practices. We've been working together with Laura Cote and the administration department in this. And I'm happy to say this is one of the areas of the Plan of Excellence where all tasks have now been implemented. One of the things that has happened here, again, relates to a board policy. Board Policy 15 is our board policy on records management. That was developed by staff and adopted by the board back in February. And at a high level, we've identified in that a lot of new categories of records. Historically, as we've talked about records, we've really talked about hard copy tangible documents. There's a recognition now that a lot more of what is generated and used by Sandag and Sandag staff are electronic records, emails and attachments to emails. And so there's a lot more of a focus and responsibility for staff in how it is that we manage and make sure that we're retaining those properly. It also expanded the responsibility here, not just to Sandag staff, but also to consultants who are supplementing and assisting Sandag staff and recognizing that they also have a responsibility of records management and retention. And overall, the policy reflected the board's policy of transparency in these records to make sure that our overall program here is done such that these records will be available to the public and the public can effectively see and review those records. We've also worked with all of our directors to identify all these different categories of records, and internally we've updated what we call our records retention schedule. So every department has identified these are the types of documents, records, digital or otherwise, that we produce, and this is the amount of time that staff will hold on to those records to make sure that we're keeping them for the right amount of time. We've also developed an internal administrative policy explaining not just the board policy, Board Policy 15, but also all the rules, the California Public Records Act, and the cases that help to interpret that, and kind of boil all those down in a format that is understandable, hopefully, to our employees, and that is now part of our employee handbook. It's something that has been distributed to all of our employees. And finally, our legal team has conducted a records management training, a 1-hour training for every employee at Sandag. We did this over 15 different sessions, making sure that we're covering all of our departments. And by that, we have explained kind of this hierarchy of the law, the board policy, our internal administrative policies, and help them to understand their responsibilities as employees to properly manage records, and maybe more importantly, to have a good one-on-one question and answer session. This is something that we made a commitment through that board policy to continue on an annual basis, to hit every one of our employees every year to make sure that they're kept up to date on any new developments in this and to make sure that we're answering any new issues that are coming up by them. And although we've completed all the identified tasks in this area, we're continuing to look for best practices in records organization to be more efficient as we search for records. We're also looking to leverage some software solutions that'll help us to be more efficient. One of our big efforts that's really ramped up in the past years in our office has been responding to Public Records Act requests. We go back, maybe as recent as about 10 years, these were, maybe in the teens, where now they're measured in the hundreds, and so we want to make sure that as we deal with that, we're almost more like a law firm dealing with complex litigation and having to deal with lots of records, and we want to make sure we're using our staff time as effectively as we can to do that well. And again, we'll be providing ongoing training for staff every year on our records management and records retention. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to David, who is going to discuss progress overall on our transparency initiatives. Yes, sir.
Great reason. I'm just curious because it's, you know, the performance audit is done here every 3 years, and sort of and on Transnet, specifically on Transnet. This performance audit is going to be on sandag, the whole structure of sandag. Does that include? Will that include Transnet and how that's been implemented, and how did you'll have 2 reports on Transnet? That's the case, and how does that play out?
I'd say. Go ahead.
Let me add, no, we've had that discussion, and no, I mean, the ordinance, the Transnet ordinance actually has a real specific thing, giving those responsibilities to you as the Independent Taxpayer Oversight Committee. The item we're gonna bring to the Audit Committee, I forget, next month, October, next month, really is more education. This is what Italk does, this is the scope of their audit, because I don't, Brad, to answer your question, I don't think we should have any kind of overlap there. There's plenty of things that the independent performance auditor, we have a wide breadth of activity that we do at sandag.
Yeah.
And so I think you guys will have the Transnet portion covered, and you're vested with that. And then the audit committee really needs to look at other aspects of our agency operations.
And then just a follow-up, as far as who, Evershank, would they be prohibited from, is there concern about having them do the oversight one, applying for this as well?
We haven't gotten that far, really. It's, the division is actually not to hire, the board debated whether to hire kind of consultant staff or an actual staff person to serve as an independent performance auditor. They went with the staff person. So we will have a staff person that's under contract with the board to serve as an independent performance auditor. Whether that's that will, and then the other next step will be, you know, what's the scope, what's the quantity and kind of scope and breadth of the audits, and how many folks does that person need to, you know, conduct audits, and whether we do it as additional staff at sandag, or they're able to hire, you know, like a Schoberg, or like firms that assist with that. That's still to be determined. The first step is like getting that person here. Yeah.
Stuart, are you on that audit committee?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
That's what I thought.
He'll be a great bridge, because he knows the scope of both, right? Or
My concern, I think, is what Brad was driving at, is the Transnet ordinance specified certain audit functions, and now the state legislation specified certain audit functions. Are you comfortable that we rationalize those independent of whether it would violate the ordinances, but from a practical point of view, that we're not doing duplicate work or conflicting work? And if there is that potential, can we adjust the ordinances somehow to eliminate requirements on Italk that are going to be performed at the sandag level? Or is there no concern that there's overlap and redundancy?
I wouldn't say concern's a word. I think our goal is so there is not overlap. I don't think we expect the audit committee and independent performance auditor to audit the same things that Italk would be auditing. So I mean, that's the goal. There's not going to be overlap or duplication. The question about whether or not, if that were the case, or whether it all should vest with the audit committee, I got to double check. I don't know if that's a section of the ordinance that can actually be changed by the board or not. So,
I was just curious.
Yeah.
And my understanding, the new independent auditor, that the decision is to hire staff versus a consultant.
Yes.
Does that staff person report to the audit committee or through the sandag organization?
To the committee and the board.
The committee, yeah, to the committee and the board.
You own that
It's
person?
literally to the committee and the board, is the way it's specified.
So you own the person, not right? That's the independence.
Ready to go on? Okay, I'm David Hicks. I'm your Director of Communications. And these next two are related to communications. They're not quite as cut and dried as what John, they're sort of like the opposite. They're harder to check the box on these a little bit, because they're kind of how we conduct our business, our core values. So we have to reaffirm them over time, again and again, with every new staff member and through training and that sort of thing. So the first being transparency, and it's not exclusive to communications. Obviously, everything that these people have been talking about for the last half hour has to do with transparency in our functions here at sandag. Particularly what Jose and what Ray are talking about are about, like exposing more info more carefully to the board, vetting things more carefully, that sort of thing. That's all goes to transparency. So, but when it does come to communications, we have taken some specific steps along those lines. So, First is we updated our board policy 25. The board updated its board policy 25 to re-express those core values in policy. Open, honest, transparent communications. Just to lay that down, it's always been part of our handbook. We want it to be part of our policy. And then we updated our ethics training that every staff member here needs to take every couple of years, and to talk a little bit more about the gray areas of doing the right thing and how you communicate, how you deal with the public, in addition to what the specific laws in terms of not taking gifts or those kind of things. There's a way to conduct yourself in a transparent manner. So we take those values and we and that basic reaffirming of the values, try to apply them in a practical sense. So as an example, right now we have something we call the Agenda League. They're like trying to take feedback that we've gotten about being more transparent and accessible. Not always just withholding information, because we're not really been accused of withholding information, but having so much information, it's so difficult to sift through that to make it more understandable, readable, reachable, gettable, that kind of thing. So as we work through redoing our agendas, we're simplifying them and making them easier to understand in a short period of time in more human language. And right now we're undertaking this sort of a much bigger process of updating our website. And that's a core tenet that we're going to have as we think through how to reorganize that website. And it actually kind of goes to something that this body has asked for in your triennial audit. You talked a lot about making the Transnet extension programs successes, or it's the data and information available about its progress more readily available. And through the proliferation of our websites, sometimes it can be hard to understand who's building what and how and where the money is going, that kind of thing. That's going to be a core tenet as we try to consolidate and make more understandable our web process. So hence transparency. Then next is stakeholder outreach. So if transparency is kind of how we conduct our work, stakeholder outreach would be kind of what we're specifically doing, our processes, who we're reaching out to, how we're going about getting our work done. And just as a reminder, the Plan of Excellence is this sort of conglomeration of feedback that we've gotten from you, from that Houston Hennigan report, from the public, from the press, from the board. And one of the places we got feedback was from the Taxpayers Association. They had a really detailed report, and it requested that we do a lot of things. One of them was, again, simplify it and make it more accessible. The other was, another common one in there was use our member agencies both to communicate to and with them, but also as conduit out into their constituencies. So that's something that like a specific action that we've been taking. And so in reality, what we've actually been doing there is spending more time sitting down with our member agencies where we're doing work, as an example. So on that North Coast Corridor project, we're meeting on a weekly basis with the city of Encinitas, where most of the current project work is going on around San Elijo Lagoon, sitting down with their city staff and elected officials so that they know what's coming, and then that's integrated into our outreach. It helps us be more effective, and it really helps them be able to deal with their constituencies. So I would just give you a couple other examples of that. Like right now we're working on the regional plan. That's a massive effort, the sort of signature effort of this organization, and that we're really bending over backwards to get board member involvement in that process for the same reasons, to be able to, so they're fully educated, so that they can get their councils fully educated, and then they can help us get their constituents educated. Another easy example on this is right now our board leadership is going out with some basics about what Sandag has done in the last year, what they have done for each individual jurisdiction, and they're making presentations to every single city council. They've started about a month ago, and they'll go for another couple months, updating them on Sandag's progress and giving them some simple, usable info that they can use to communicate with their staffs. So with that, I'll turn this back to Melissa.
I realized up front I didn't introduce myself to you. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Melissa Kaufman, and I manage the Human Resources program here at Sandag. And Kim asked me to be involved in this project. I think thinking that it was essentially an organization development initiative, which oftentimes falls to the human resources team to do that. So I've been working very closely with the directors here, other directors in the organization to assist with sort of the collaboration, the compilation of information accomplishments under the plan. So I'd like to just add a couple of remarks about the last component, last segment of the Plan of Excellence. And this is the one that we've titled Organization Structure. Clearly falls sort of in my neck of the woods. This particular component of the plan ties back to one of the recommendations that came from the Houston-Hannigan report. And within that report, it was recommended that Sandag take a look at the structure of the organization, how the different departments are organized, what functions exist in those departments, but also to take a look at staffing resources. Does the agency have adequate staffing resources to perform all the functions and responsibilities assigned to the organization? So that's an initiative that will be undertaking in the coming months. We're currently developing a scope of work. We're going to hire a management consultant to conduct that work for us. And again, we're expecting that to begin later this year. And the recommendations that come from that organization review study will be shared with the board of directors for support and moving forward on any of the recommendations there. So with that, I'd like just to offer a couple of remarks as we conclude our presentation and then answer any other questions that you may have. The first perhaps is just to sort of restate the tagline that we've adopted for the Plan of Excellence, and that is, through the plan we want to demonstrate that Sandag is committed to listening to stakeholders, taking on board the feedback that's provided. We want to show that we're learning from experience. We also want to show a commitment to continual improvement and being the best regional agency that we can. I mentioned up front that a number of changes that have been implemented to date are not one-time check-the-box items. These are now components that are part of how we do business and will continue to be part of what you see from staff and from the organization going forward. I think I also mentioned up front that we intend to provide another update to the board of directors and to anyone else who's interested about the status of the Plan of Excellence toward the end of the year, in December, I believe. So with that, we're available to answer any other questions that you may have about the plan.
Alyssa, that's a great, you all did a great job. I took one question and one comment. The independent review of department structure and staffing at the end, how does that jive with the performance audits? And how much overlap is that? And is that sort of one and the same?
I'm not sure that I would consider it to be one and the same. We can certainly see some sort of overlap between those two things. But the intention would be, as I mentioned, an external consultant with that expertise in evaluating organization structure and things of that nature to assist with that.
And then the comment, the tagline is great. Who came up with that one? Did all
Who
of you?
came up with that one?
That's a great.
The chair.
I mean, with all the things that have gone on at Sandag the last year, I think that is
The
sets
chair
the
was
tone
really
for what.
instrumental, I think, in identifying sort of the key things he wanted the plan to represent. I think one of our marketing staff, one of David's staff, was the one who actually put all the words together for it.
I think it's perfect. Perfect.
Yeah.
I'm going to officially take credit.
Yeah, Brett, on the org review, what it really is, I've been at Sandag for quite a while now, and when I started, we had just under 100 people. And the general organizational structure has been the same with an executive director, a deputy, and then kind of the department directors underneath and their staffs and stuff. Some of the work we've done, you've heard a lot from Ray over the last several months on just the complexity of the modeling work that we've done. There's a lot of as Sandag's grown and taken over the toll road, for example, we've added another department director, we've added this, and so the agency sort of grown organically, and it was the opportunity was, can we get some assistance, work through, and kind of take a look at, is this the right organizational structure for the agency, given the complexity of the work and really the breadth of the work that we do. When I started with 100, we didn't build projects, right? And so now we have this incredible project delivery teams and all the financial folks that oversee project controls and dollars and cents and whatnot. So it's really given us an opportunity to step back and look at, like, is this how we should be organized? One of the things we've used from a staffing perspective is, rather than build just adding what we call regular staff, for the projects where we know there's some funding that's coming in, whether it's a grant-funded project or it's a major capital project. Like with Midcoast, we need to ramp up because it's a huge project that's going through our project delivery pipeline. We've hired folks in limited term roles. In other words, hey, we have funding for 3 years, we're hiring you for 3 years, because that's the way we were able to kind of manage staffing. Well, we need to take a look at that, because over time, are we having people that are in these sort of limited term roles that are really doing core functions of the agency that we think they're gonna stay with us forever, and really should we be having those as limited term staff versus regular core staff? So that's going to give us an opportunity to look at that holistically. I think it's still a good way that we're a staffing strategy we're using to have balanced limited term folks with core, because sometimes grant funds or certain things come and go, right? There's ebbs and flows with that. So, but it gives us an opportunity to kind of just take a breather, take a perspective, and see what's the best thing for the agency as a whole. Yeah.
A very quick question. Italk puts out an annual report which goes to the sandag board. Has sandag considered putting out an annual report to go to the community?
Yes. David,
we're sort of doing that piecemeal now, in the sense that I was explaining before how the chair is bringing with him these one-pagers on each city, right, which sort of gives a general overview of what Sandag has accomplished in the last year, and then what we've done for your city. And what Kim has tasked us with is kind of combining that into something that's more like what you're talking about next year going forward.
All right. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I guess tagging on to that a little bit, because I think I'm really happy to hear, I mean, the transparency and stakeholder communication thing, I think I've always felt that the biggest issue isn't transparency per se. I mean, I look at what we get in terms of the detailed report and things for Transnet, and I know the board is getting, volumes more than that, and so when some of the, discussions happened months ago about, things going on, and I would hear in different organizations I'm involved with, or in my own business, or people would say, they would jump to these conclusions that, oh, they're hiding stuff or things, and I'm like, no, it's almost like there's too much information. It's like the taxpayers group that gave you some comment on, and it's like, to me, the biggest issue isn't creating more, I mean, I know some of it's necessary, but to respond to the thing, but it's not more audits, more reports, more. It's really the bigger challenge to me is condensing it down to communication that's understandable, and that, like, I know for a fact that some cities that I'm in tune with pretty well, that their board reps don't inform their city councils of the actions that are going. They sit on your board, but they're not sharing with their peers at their city council, local city council and stuff. So, and sometimes you wonder, do they have the materials to even efficiently do that, because they've got, well, on an iPad or otherwise, they've got volumes of stuff. So, I would just highly encourage, and I'm happy to see that there's some focus on that, because I think that's more important, to have understandable information. That, I mean, you guys as an agency do a great job of document. I mean, to me, it's to say it's not transparent, it doesn't make it, just to me doesn't make sense, because I see what you guys do every day and how everything's available. I mean, it would shock me if something's hidden somewhere that's not available in some report, but it's how to get it out there.
So just, two things. First, thanks for coming in today, and it's a lot of senior time devoted to this exercise, but I think it's really important. I'd also, in the topic relating to communications, I think this presentation itself is a really fabulous example of how a lot of really complex and voluminous information can in fact be distilled down and communicated in a way that becomes very accessible and very digestible and impactful for people all across the spectrum of casual observer to decision maker. So I think, you know, whoever really kind of took charge of just simply the communication of this, I think this is a great example that, to Kai's point, the rest of the organizational materials could take some lessons from, because it's just really, really well done. The thing I was just kind of curious about is, with regard to the type of consultant who would do the task you were describing of organization. I mean, is that like a McKinsey kind of firm, or are there people who do like HR specialty? I mean, I'm just out of curiosity, who even does that? Is there a way that you can point to a couple of names without, you know, getting in trouble with regard to the selection process?
I mean, the McKinseys is certainly a firm that we're familiar with that could do this work. We are currently sort of connecting with like organizations who've done this type of work to understand what consultants have used. I believe the firm Managing Partners is a firm that we've heard from, Kaufman Associates, CPS HR is another firm that we're familiar with that tend to have expertise in the public sector, but we also are familiar with other firms that can do the work. So we do think there are a big selection of firms.
Okay, good.
That would be
because it just sort of strikes me that the organizational structure versus the staffing are almost two different things, but maybe they're so closely linked that there are firms that actually do the whole package. So, okay.
I've certainly seen examples of other organizations who have undertaken projects similar to the one that we are looking to undertake. Certainly what prompted them to undertake the work could be a little different, and so there's some that's reflected in their scopes, but this general look at how sort of the internal departments are organized and then staff and resources is something that we've seen in other places.
Okay, so the bottom line is you're comfortable, based on your research to date, that you will find a solution that will help this get accomplished.
We're very confident that we will find a nice consultant to partner with us on that.
I have a great question. You obviously have done a tremendous amount of work on your forecasting tools, your forecasting objectives, and clearly a lot of improvement in the ability to forecast sales tax revenue, which is in the final product that drives everything. One of the inputs. You're also doing a lot of work apparently on forecasting costs out in the future, none of which is easy, particularly the time horizons you're attempting to do it. My question is, given your abilities to do both the revenues and the cost, to what extent has some of the variations we've experienced in the past been attributable to scope growth? And how do you deal with scope growth issues? When someone sets out at the beginning of 20 years a wish list of all the projects we want to tackle all these, and there's some preliminary concept of what that scope is. In the end of the day, how much variation has there been on the resultant scope versus the preliminary assumption?
That's a great question. I think Jose is probably better suited to answer that since it's his job.
So,
pretty good hand up there.
So what I would say is, if you look at certain projects, I mean, when you look at the scope in the ordinance, it's very broad, right? So I'm just going to take an example of a project that we've just barely gotten started on, Highway 78. So Highway 78, if you look at the ordinance, it says add 2 more lanes from Highway 5 to 15. That's it, right? It doesn't really go into any other detail. When the original estimates were done, there were certain assumptions made in terms of, okay, what would it take to add 2 more lanes between 5 and 15? There's been a feasibility study done, and that feasibility study identified certain local interchanges that needed to be rebuilt because you couldn't fit two lanes without having to, tear down the existing bridge. Some of those costs were not originally assumed. So at the end of the day, when we finally complete Highway 78, we will, have 2 lanes, right? but it's probably going to cost more than was originally anticipated because of all these other things that needed to be done in order to do that very basic scope as it was defined in the ordinance. So is it scope creep? I wouldn't call it scope creep, but I think it was scope refinement in terms of better understanding what is it that needed to get done in order to accomplish that kind of very broadly defined scope in the ordinance.
I understand the process fully. Been there, done that. My question is, in the big picture, trying to explain the variances of original projection and the resultants, how much does the, I call scope growth?
Yeah, and I think that's where you know, we need to do a better job of explaining, hey look, you know, this is what the original assumptions were, and so as we move forward, these are some of the things that we're finding out that need to be done in order to accomplish the scope. Board, you have the option of, you know, going ahead with those additional improvements that are needed, or perhaps something else needs to be done in order to, you know, fit it within the available funding at the time. So I think there's going to be, you know, just greater communication, and not just communication, but more transparent communication in terms of these are the assumptions that were made, this is how they're changing, these are the reasons that they're changing, and board, we need to hear from you in terms of what is it that you want us to do.
Just curious if a historical look back, how big a variation, if you take each one of the projects that's been finished, how big of a variation was there, and the ultimate cost attributable to scope growth, and is it a broad range or a narrow range, and is your forecasting methodology now going to put that as a factor in that someone has a preliminary scope and you say historically we've seen 33% growth on average of historical of scope growth, and do you factor that into the model?
So my forecast wouldn't take that into account because the two things that I'm looking at is what is the potential for the region to collect revenue, and that would be independent of how much the projects cost. And then in terms of the costs, what I'm helping the transit department with is to try to understand the variability in terms of construction costs based upon the number of bidders that we have at different points in time, and also like the components, the steel, the concrete, those type of things have huge variations in them. And so we're taking a look at all the information from Caltrans historically to understand how much these projects are going to cost. But in terms of what actually gets built, and if we had scoped, you know, a pylon or whatever for a bridge that was 4 feet in diameter, it ends up getting built 10 feet, now it's 160 feet deep. Those things, I'm not forecasting those additional costs. We could go back, I suppose, and take a look at the original estimates that we had, and then the final project that was built. There are a few projects we could probably look at to see what the ratio is of that, to get an understanding, but we have not done that specific.
I just suggest it might be worth looking at a lot of things you do, but that's a tremendous variation and not have it in your overall model of this one.
Yeah, actually, if I could just add to that, and I'm not sure this is exactly where you're going, but kind of like from a taxpayer perspective, you know, as you allude to, Jose, in the ordinance that it references some number of projects, and there's an estimate of what the total cost will be, and there's an implied kind of, we expect that within the life of the program we'll be able to finance all these things, right? So I think Dick raised an interesting point, which is that if you look back, and whether you want to call it scope growth per se, I think of it more in terms of, you know, I guess the original definition of are you sufficiently reviewing the projects when you were to put a number attached to them for sake of communicating with the taxpayer. So maybe an example would be if you're looking at, you know, further trolley expansion, there's like an average cost per mile, right? Well, if you just take the average cost per mile and say it's X number of miles, without taking into consideration what's the specific terrain, and could that specific terrain that we're looking at triple that number, you know, you're not doing yourselves right by way of the communication with the taxpayer. So it kind of comes down to, if your review of history says, yeah, you know, we're really undershooting this because we're doing a review that's kind of based on that average and we're not looking further, and that's probably insulting to all the people who actually do this stuff, because I'm sure you do a much better job than that. But just to illustrate the point, it would be interesting to sort of have that context Because the worst thing is, you know, to find yourself in a situation where you've laid out these projects where there's a public expectation, and then as you're saying, you're finding that, you know, for not because it's not proper diligence, it's a variety of things, that the costs of some of these things have really strained the ability to deliver. But I'm not sure that's exactly what.
Well, yeah, I mean, the mid-coast trolley, I don't know when someone originally conceptualized it, whether they envisioned a good chunk of it was going to be overhead at a tremendous increase in cost. You can't get a good estimate until you do your engineering. Well, someone wants to know what's going to cost before you do your engineering, so it's inherent in the process.
And you know, just to your point, I mean, you could invest. I mean, the cost estimates that are put into long-range plans, like the Transnet. The Transnet is a 40-year long-range plan, right? And so some of those projects are going to get done in the earlier years, but some of those projects may get done until, you know, 20, 30 years down the line. And so you may want to invest on additional engineering studies and traffic studies and whatnot today to have a better confidence level. But it's you know, it costs money to do that, right? But at the same time, you would be doing those studies based on today's conditions and today's circumstances. You know, 20, 30 years down the line, things may change. You may have additional regulatory requirements that are needed. You may have different technologies. So yes, you may do as much as you can, do as much due diligence as you can. But for some of those longer term projects, there's always a degree of uncertainty.
I have one last question, Renee. I don't know who to respond to it, but the new to be established Office of Quality Assurance. My mind, quality assurance goes to a high volume manufacturing operation. The classic quality assurance.
You'd be disappointed then because it's not that big. So historically, the way that we had quality assurance set up here is that each person QA'd their own work. Okay, so they were responsible. Actually, they were the ownership of the data. So they would work with, like, let's say the person who worked with the Department of Finance would be the person who brought that data in. They would work with it, do the analysis that needed to be done. They'd check their own work, and then we'd move it over to the model. So data was, so the quality assurance was embedded within the process, and it's the same people doing it who did the actual analysis. And so what happens there is just like when you proofread, sometimes you miss your own mistakes. So what we did is we created a completely separate department. So these people do not report to the data people who create the models. They're completely independent. It's separate. And what they do is, before the data is available to either publish or use in models or publish to the public, we have a separate group of people who take a look at it and put it through a set of tests. And what happens is that some of those tests bring up questions, like, why is there so much variation in this particular thing? And what ends up happening is that we call a PRP, a peer review process, and the quality assurance people say, here's what we found, and then the analysts explain what they did. And based upon that, there's dialogue that goes back and forth, and then we make improvements to the model. So this is completely independent. I can give you one example really quickly that'll help you understand. The model wasn't wrong, but the QA department found something that helped us improve the model. And that would be, for instance, and I think I've reported here before, is that the population is expected to grow by 700,000 in the future, of which 500,000 of those people will be age 65 and plus. So the area here, San Diego, will become much older. Okay, so our model forecasts lots of more older people. So it ages everybody. But what we found was that there are certain areas, like for instance military housing and housing that is around universities that typically students live in, that don't change their age structure as much as the rest of the region is going to. And so in our first model, the draft, what we found is that we aged everybody, and now all of a sudden you have like 30-year-old people living around UCSD. Well, that might not be correct, but there's no way for us to really know that until somebody independently looked at that, and then they came back and said, this doesn't make sense because Pacific Beach and Mission Beach, the age structure doesn't change there. Historically, it's always been younger people. So then we go back and we improve the model. And what we do is we identify where military housing is. We identify areas most likely for student housing, and we put that into the model, and then we reallocate all of the old people who are going to be here into other areas. So there's higher concentrations than in Rancho Bernardo and areas like that. So the QA department is independent. The forecast modeler said, my model is perfect. The algorithm works, the data is exactly what it is, but then intuitively it didn't make sense. And so we're always striving to give the best answers. And so this is how that department, in my vision, works, is that I give you my work, you check it, tell me if it's as good as it can be, and if not, then we change it, and we go forward with another vision.
That's another question, but it came to me in listening to all that you folks do, and I gather you're the only entity within the global San Diego community that attempts to make these demographic growth sector forecasts for a multitude of variables. Is that data readily available to the public?
It is. We have a website. It's going to be incorporated into Dave's larger vision of what the Sandag website is, but it's called Data Surfer, and you can go up there, and for any geography, you can download the current year's data, you can download historical data, and also the forecast information that we have, especially as it relates to the demographic and economic information.
Tremendous value there. I'm thinking of the healthcare industry here in San Diego. They're always worrying about what the future looks like and how they staff themselves for the future. They don't necessarily have the resources to do what your folks are doing. So
they don't. It's like for Health and Human Services is one of our customers that we provide data to down at an incredibly detailed level, because they're tracking diseases and all sorts of stuff, and they use our information. So we work directly with them.
I don't know how well that's understood by the community, or whether that should be advertised more as a service that Sandag provides too.
Do you have any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Move on to item number 7. This is the 2018 RTIP. And Sue, welcome back.
Third time's the charm, right? Yes, it's done. Okay, so just a reminder that as an MPO, San Diego is required by state and federal law to develop and adopt a regional transportation improvement program, or the RTIP. The RTIP is a 5-year program of proposed major transportation projects which implements the prioritized projects in the regional plan. It includes the Transnet program of projects. The RTIP is updated every 2 years, and the 2018 RTIP covers fiscal years 2019 through fiscal year 2023. Italk reviewed the draft 2018 RTIP and the Transnet program of projects at its July meeting, and subsequently the board voted to release the draft for a 30-day public comment period on July 27th. During the public comment period, minor changes to Transnet funding were made for 36 projects, primarily to reconcile programming to actuals and to adjust estimated carryover funding. The City of San Diego requested that 3 projects included in the draft be marked as complete, and 1 project was labeled as delayed. And finally, the Transnet Active Transportation Grant Program, Planning and Capital Awards, and the Smart Growth Planning Grant Awards approved by the board on July 27th were added to the proposed final. Attachment 1, beginning on page 4, is the listing of all the projects funded with Transnet funds included in the proposed final 2018 RTIP. Resolutions for the Transnet program of projects were due to Sandag by June 29th for all local agencies, and all resolutions were received. Staff have reviewed all projects submitted and considered that they are eligible for Transnet funding. Attachment 2, beginning on page 118, is a program summary of major projects by mode that categorizes all the projects into modes, as well as showing the breakdown of funding by type, federal, state Transnet, and local or private funds. Overall, Transnet programming has been reduced by approximately $12 million from the draft, primarily due to the removal of the San Diego projects which were completed. Attachment 3 on page 119 provides a cumulative capacity analysis regarding revenue versus program for Transnet local street improvement funds in the 2018 RTIP for all local agencies. So we're presenting this item to you today for your review and discussion. No comments pertaining to Transnet projects were received at the public hearing held at the Transportation Committee on September 7th. And the Transportation Committee recommended that the Board of Directors adopt the 2018 RTIP. Any comments received from Italk today will be brought to the Board at the September 28th meeting when it will be requested to adopt the final 2018 RTIP and make its air quality performance determination. So that's my report. Is there any questions that I can answer?
Mr. Chair, you might comment for Greg, our new member.
Simplifying the data.
Greg, we see a lot of documents on this committee. They're all important, but this is one of the most important that we do receive. I consider it the Bible for the next 5 years of how Transnet funds are being going to be spent. You don't need to memorize it. If individual projects do come up for discussion, you will find them in this document, which we call the RTIP. So of all the acronyms you're going to learn, that is an important one. That's my only comment.
Thank you. It is the thickest of packets today.
The city removed 4 projects. Is the meeting from anywhere near for me to see which ones they said were complete or delayed?
Yeah, it's I can have Ariana send out the list, but it was the Claremont 163 project, which was completed, and the Georgia Street Bridge project was delayed because they were requesting additional grant funding to complete that one. I-5 Strano Valley Road project was completed, and the La Jolla Mesa Drive sidewalk project. So those 3 projects.
Okay. The delayed one got removed, or it got?
It's not in the RTIP at this time because there's no funding in this period. We can't program a project if there's no funding in the current 5 years.
So that's what I guess my question was, delayed because they don't have funding.
Right.
Okay.
But they're still seeking funding.
I think I got it.
Questions or comments?
This is, I mentioned this to Greg before the meeting. This is what I was talking about. And it's very necessary. You guys do a tremendous job of managing funds coming in and out, moving between projects, things delayed. In terms of our responsibility of trying to render any effective oversight, it's most difficult. And we're down in the weeds because what you might move this time, next report you move it back because funding became available someplace else. I mean, that's what you guys do, and you do it well. But it's like a telephone book. You want to look up the project in your neighborhood and see what's going on. But in terms of passing judgment on whether this is a good or bad plan, that's for me, personally impossible. I'm missing over for Greg, but what this committee expects of you as new member to keep this.
This is part of the test.
Just one question, and maybe this relates back to our Plan of Excellence data management. I'm just looking at in attachment 3, table 2, and I hate to be sort of like a gotcha, but I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding something. Looking at Solana Beach.
Yes.
In the portion of the table to the right.
What page is that?
It's like literally, it's like the very last page. Very last page. And again, I just want to make sure I'm not confused, as opposed to I'm not trying to be, it's not a gotcha thing. Column G, Solana Beach, showing a balance of 194. That number is supposed to be column E minus column F. And it just, I don't have my calculator here, but 794 minus 385 doesn't strike me as adding to 194. So I'm just kind of wondering if this is one of those data management kind of things, or
yeah, we'll take a look at that.
If this, yeah, I guess. Anyway, just I don't know if this report itself is a push the button, is data spit out of something. at least in that instance, it looks like something, because the question I was going to ask is based on your footnote that Solana Beach is restricted by available space to building additional congestion relief facilities. I was going to ask, so do they then just kind of accumulate an ever-increasing balance, or would those monies get reallocated? That's where it jumped out at me that their balance went down, which is contrary. So there's just...
Yeah, I think the percentage looks right. It's the balance that looks wrong.
Yeah, so putting aside the fact that maybe there's an error in that balance number, what actually does happen if you're saying that Solana Beach is restricted? Will they just accumulate an ever-growing balance, or is there a point where that money then gets reallocated?
Well, I mean, they're looking for funds that they can apply, that they can, the projects that they can apply the funds to, and we're also looking at the maintenance congestion relief split.
Okay, right. That may change.
So that's
here.
So that's kind of for now.
It's a small city. It's essentially built out. So congestion relief, adding new lanes. Like, where are you?
Yeah, and you don't want to incentivize people to do things that don't make sense just because it's a use it or lose it.
But the answer to Stuart's question is there's no provision for a city to relinquish its claim on monies that gets reallocated to other cities. Ordinance doesn't allow that.
No, but I think in this case it's the fact that so the city, they don't have enough space to put more facilities.
Right.
There is an exception process if they wanted to use more of these congestion relief project or dollars over on the maintenance.
Okay, so they could come and ask for.
And they're actually, I think they're considering that on this.
Yeah, got it. Okay.
So there is an exception so that they can use.
What's that? Money cannot move from one city to another city just because the city doesn't have no more use for it.
I don't think they would tell us that, but they could come and say, you know what, I don't have any congestion relief projects, but I do have maintenance needs, and so I want an exception from that rule to use so they can use the money.
Yeah. In the meantime, we can see a balanced city.
Sure.
Okay, well, we've already reviewed this 2 months ago, and they're Sue has explained these changes, and so I think we've had a good discussion.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
On to number 8. These quarterly financial reports.
Now, Greg, this is probably the next important thing that
Right.
Jonathan.
We already did EMP.
Oh, the EMP.
I mean, Dustin like that.
So we actually have Sam Dice with me today. Sam works with me in the finance department, and he has in the past put this whole report together. Just does a piece of it, and he's going to help present this item as we move along. So when staff met with Greg, what was it, last month? I touch upon this item, but what I basically told him was you're going to receive a bunch of quarterly data from me, and I'm going to go over it at your first Italk meeting, because it just so happens that we're bringing the data through the end of June 30th. So that's what we're doing. We made sure that it wasn't on consent today so that we could go through it for your benefit, and then if there's questions from anybody else. So just kind of an overview, this is just a bunch of different financial information that we provide on a quarterly basis, and we put it together based on recommendations from past triennial performance audits, but also requests of the Italk. And so it could change in the future, but for now we have the standard 6 attachments. So I'm just going to go straight into them. So attachment 1 is a quarterly report that has actually been produced since the original ordinance. What it does is it provides both the revenues, which would be the allocations, and the expenditures or the disbursements by both Transnet program, but also by local jurisdiction, those that actually receive allocations.
And so on the far left, where we have our allocations, is going to show us the actual sales tax, the transnet. We provide it by the quarter, the fiscal year, but also the cumulative, the program to date. We have an other income column, and that is cumulative as well. And that is going to have things like interest earnings in it. There was a swap of some federal funds many years ago. That's going to be in there, which is why a couple lines down, you'll see there's a huge negative number with the major quarter. They gave up their sales tax to the local jurisdictions, and the jurisdictions gave their federal over to the major corridor. And then it gives us our total revenues. And then to the right of that, the disbursements. We have our program disbursements, which are going to be payments to the jurisdictions or for vendor costs to sandag, which then some of it goes to Caltrans, or it could be for other vendor purposes. And there are also some program costs in there. Then we have our debt service. So these are the programs and jurisdictions that are in our different debt programs. We have our commercial paper as well as several different bond issuances to provide our totals. So that is going to be on page, the first and part of the second page of this report. We then have on the second page our commercial paper activity. So we have two different sections here on the left. We're just kind of giving you a snapshot of over time who has been in the commercial paper program and the amount of commercial paper that we have issued for them. It doesn't mean that they're in the program any longer. It's just a snapshot of over time. And then to the right, this is the current activity. So as of June 30th, the program was at $75 million. That's the amount that was available to issue for any of the programs or jurisdictions, as long as we had the correct approval. The activity for this quarter, so that was when we issued the 2018 short-term notes, and any commercial paper that had been used for the major corridor program at that time was then repaid. So that's that positive $8 million. And then you can see program to date where we are. So NCTD has an outstanding balance of $25.5 million, and Oceanside. We have the city of La Mesa there, even though they have zeros, because we do have an agreement with them. They have just not borrowed yet. We always keep major corridor and EMP on there because it, they come and go. So at June 30th, there was $48.4 million available to issue, should there be any need. The other activity at the bottom left, I'm sorry, was there a question? Activity.
I'm sorry, where would the city of San Diego's new piece fall in this?
We have not executed the agreement with them yet. We had to wait for the board to approve the RTIP, which is later this month, at which time.
So it's not in place yet?
It's not in place yet, right.
So
right.
it would fall in the same.
Kind of where La Mesa is right now with the blanks,
okay.
yeah. So we would
Like
throw
they
them on
wouldn't
there
have drawn from it yet,
just to show that that we have an agreement with them, right.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
Excuse me. So on the lower left-hand section, we have this other activity that we monitor. So when the ordinance allows for the major corridor EMP program to borrow sales tax from the major corridor program, because the intent of the EMP was to advance fund the program to acquire as much land as possible because it's cheaper now than it is later. And so they did that. But sales tax that comes in every year is lower in the earlier years, and then it goes up higher. But we have this debt service cost that's up here in the revenues. So they need more sales tax. So they're using sales tax from the major corridor program to bridge that gap. And we monitor that even on a monthly basis. And anytime there is a positive balance with the EMP, it repays the major corridor. So it's constantly going back and forth. And over time, this will get smaller, and major corridor will then be whole. Questions on that? Okay. Next page. On the next page, the last page of this specific attachment, so this is a snapshot of the different bond issuances that we have for the 2008, the 10A, 10B, 12, and 14. All of those proceeds are now fully used as of the end of the quarter. We still have some remaining in the 16 bonds, and of course we just recently issued the 2018, which is for the major quarter, for the Mid-Coast project specifically. And then you can see all of the jurisdictions that are within each of these different bond programs.
I'm assuming the commercial paper program, the cities that are drawing on our account, that's collateralized by our obligations to pay them their share of the tax revenues.
It comes from their allocation, their LSI, their street and road allocation.
And the overall capital structure, so to speak, is sandag. What's the priority of the commercial paper lenders versus the bond lenders?
Yeah, so we actually have 3 liens: the senior lien, then the subordinate lien, and then the junior lien. So the senior liens are the AAA rated bonds, and then comes the commercial paper, which is on the subordinate lien, and then the last lien is the junior lien, and that's the TIFIA loan.
No, it just gets better and better. It's the lowest priority. It's fixed rate, but you don't draw them, and that's the thing that makes it.
You're asking why you wouldn't draw down the TIFIA loan immediately because it's the lowest rate? Is that what you're asking?
No. Okay. If I'm understanding from prior discussions, you've got a commitment from them at a rate that was in place at that point in time, and you haven't drawn on it. Rates go up, you're able to rely on the old original rate, not paying any commitment fees or anything.
That's one of the beauties of the TIFIA loan.
That's what I'd like to get a couple.
Okay, so we'll move on to attachment 2. So this is a look at the sales tax revenue. We have 2 sections where we're providing information. The top is going to show annual information and cumulative. So this is looking at the estimates versus the actual received for each of the fiscal years for the extension ordinance. And the lower section is looking at through the end of the fiscal year 2018, and it's going to be by month. And it's the same thing, estimate versus the actuals. And so for fiscal year 18, you can see that we came in at, when we look at the current year, so fiscal year 18 versus the prior year, 17, we came at 3.53% over the prior year, and the forecast was at 3.33. So came in a little better, pretty close. Any questions on that? Okay.
So attachment 3 is the Italk operating budget analysis. This report here includes the Italk approved FY18 budget and also includes the actual revenues and expenditures to the end of the year. The actual numbers you see here are not final yet. We actually received an invoice that we'll be paying this week, so this can change the actuals. This report also shows an unspent of $44,000, which, as I said, we'll be paying an invoice this week, which will reduce that amount to $35,000. We don't expect any more changes or any adjustments, but we won't fully know for sure until we're close with the year. And this unspent balance will then be dropped off to the other available funds section at the bottom of the schedule, and this amount here will be available for future use. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I always struggle with this. You answered part of it, broke the code. The 44,000 is a actual current balance. It's not a projected at the end of the period.
Yes.
Your projection at the end of the period is that 44,000 favorable variance is going to decline to 27.
35,000. Decline to 35,000.
Yeah, so the 44 is based, at the time that we ran the numbers, that was, taking into account the actual revenues received versus what was spent, and this is the balance. This is the available.
But you know you're going to spend more for the remainder of the year.
I'm sorry?
You know you're going to spend more for the remainder of the year. This 27.
We know, well, we're paying an invoice this week, so yes, we do have.
The 44 is not a projected underrun at the end of the year. It's a current.
It's a current, yeah. It's a current at the time that we ran the numbers. Right now it's about 35.
Okay.
Yeah. And we expect it to stay about the 35. Yeah.
So you expect how much of an underrun at the end of the year?
And unspent about 35,000.
That'd be 35,000.
That will then carry forward, and the ITAC can use.
Am I supposed to see that on these numbers?
No, you don't see that in these numbers. Yeah.
And you guys normally have a surplus or an underrun, as you call it, because you usually put, roughly 20 grand aside for outside consulting services if needed that you historically haven't used. I think my recollection, the only time we used it was when we did the exchange with the 1.5 when we did that loan. We had someone outside come in and kind of take a look at those things. So you historically have had 20, 30-ish, unspent at the end of the year that carries forward.
And it compounds every couple of years.
Yeah, and every
renege
couple
on our
of years you
own
say,
budget allocation.
keep the money, yeah.
I keep reading articles, I think, about taxing internet sales. Is that, am I reading it correctly? And is that going to affect us in the future?
Yeah, the Wayfair decision. Jim Miller, I'm the senior economist here. The Wayfair decision was rendered and allows states to tax internet sales. The interesting thing with California is they haven't really decided, the Department of Finance hasn't really decided how they're going to approach the new Wayfair decision. So we don't yet know what their approach is going to be and how that's going to affect our revenues. We are looking at that for our revenue projections, of course. We expect them to go up a certain percentage. I think it's $3 to $6 million on an annual basis if we collect all of the money that is estimated to be available to us. But again, a lot of that's going to depend on how the state decides to approach the Wayfair decision, and I haven't heard, they've kind of been wringing their hands on that, as far as I know.
Thank you.
Okay, and then attachment 4. This is taking a look at the 30% portion, the maintenance portion of the local street and road for the cities and the county. The ordinance allows no more than 30% to be used for this purpose. And so it is monitored on a regular basis here at Sandag, and this kind of gives us a way of looking at that. So it's showing the funds allocated, including those other funds like interest earnings and that RS swap. And then we have what's expended, and to provide us with a balance, and all of them are above 0, so that's good. And then our column F, so when you compare column E, which is the unspent total, then we have our column F, which is the cash balance. Those may not be the same. If a jurisdiction is using more than 70% on their congestion relief projects, which according to the ordinance they can use all of it on congestion relief, then they would be in fact using some of the cash that we also monitor as part of this 30%, right? So it uses some of those dollars, and it reduces the available cash for maintenance projects. But at the same time, we have to monitor, taking the cash piece aside, based on the revenues coming in, what is 30% of that? We need to know what that number is at all times, because we can't let that number ever go above 30, or their expenditures ever go above 30%. This is just based on the information that's available to us during the year. The big review is done by the auditors during the annual compliance audit, and that is one of the procedures that they perform. They take into account the activity of the jurisdiction as well as what sandag has to put everything together and say, here now are the real total revenues and the real total expenditures. And then we look at that and make sure that that doesn't exceed 30%. Yes.
This is probably less a question for you so that it might be for Kim or Jose or somebody else. But you know, our own Triennial performance report, as well as I think other information, maybe the 10-year look back from the board suggested a look at this 70-30 split. Could you just give us a snapshot of the process for how that's going to be reviewed? And my understanding is it would require a 2/3 vote of the board to actually change that. Is that
Let me start, and then I'll ask probably Jose to jump in, because he's been in meetings with some of the public works directors. There's definitely a few cities that are sort of leading the charge on wanting a little more flexibility on the 70-30 split. Some of it, you saw from our prior discussions, certain circumstances with the cities, they don't have enough projects to really do congestion relief. There's another example, other examples where, as you're trying to do complete streets or encourage transit or walking, are there does that, they'd be a good sort of use of funds? Does a 70-30 sort of prevent or make it more difficult to do that? So just what's the nature of that? So we've been working with a subset, I believe, of the CTAC, which are the public works directors in the region. They have some thoughts about that. The process itself will be to kind of vet those recommendations through you guys and the Transportation Committee. And it could be an ordinance change. So it could be, an ordinance change to either change the percentage, take off this 70-30 requirement, and that would require 2/3 vote of the board. There may be something that doesn't require an ordinance change exactly. The way we've implemented that 70-30 split is the board has adopted a board policy to define what categories of projects are considered part of the 70% congestion relief and what are considered part of the 30. So in theory, you may not need an ordinance change depending on what the specifics are. You could just change the definition of what we consider congestion relief and what we consider, maintenance activities. So it's still sort of to be determined, but I think in terms of the review process and ultimate approval process, it will come here, it will go to the Transportation Committee, it will go to the board.
And just, is there a time frame for that's targeted for completion of a review, or is it just kind of it's an organic? It's done when it's done.
So CTAC formed an ad hoc group late last fiscal year. They've met on a regular basis since then, and they've actually reviewed at the CTAC just this month, last week, kind of a first go at what they, the options that they might consider bringing forward, and so they're anticipated to review that again at their October meeting. One thing we would like to bring at the same time is this whole discussion of the performance framework that the audit also discusses, so that those two items can be looked at together, because I think that would make sense. So hopefully we can bring that to you here in the next couple, 3 months.
We don't have a hard date on once it's an ordinance change. What we're trying to do is collect the performance audit and other things raised issues with, hey, maybe there are some certain changes in the transit ordinance which we'd like to make. There's sort of a parallel thing with the operators working on the transit operators on looking at their fare structure to make it more simplify it, make it one kind of regional fare structure versus one for MTS, one for NCTV, which would kind of simplify those things. Some of those, depending on the recommendations that their boards pursue, may require changes to the ordinance. Things like the discount rate or discount percentage for youth passes and for senior disabled Medicare passes. So I think our goal is to kind of collect, to the extent that we need changes to the ordinance, to collect them all in kind of one fell swoop and do the changes all together. And so while there's no hard date, it's something that fairly pressing items we're trying to do. So we're thinking like it's going to happen sometime this fall. And I'd say an ordinance change would be either late in the year or early next year for some of these items, just because other things are driving sort of parallel efforts.
Got it.
Yeah.
Ken, to the extent that there might be a modification between the 70-30 split, no matter how it's achieved, the maintenance distributions to the cities are dependent upon the city maintaining their historic organic, and no one's talking about changing that.
No, we haven't talked about their maintenance of effort.
That's pretty critical.
Yeah.
With the original intent of the
Yeah,
ordinance.
actually, that's lockbox.
Yeah, maintenance of effort is a lockbox provision.
Yeah.
The maintenance of effort, which is what you're talking about, that's a lockbox provision, so only the voters can do away with that.
Yeah. And some of the things, as we look at the 70-30 split, the congestion relief versus maintenance, I mean, to the extent that the gas tax dollars through SB1 are not repealed in November, that has provided sort of another stream of funding to local governments to really look at state of good repair. So things like pavement, improving pavements, things like doing that. So to the extent that if there is this other source of fund that is a continuing source, you still need to relook at the 70. That's something that wasn't there before. That's nearly doubling their gas tax monies that they receive. Should the gas tax, should the voters not approve Prop 6 on the November ballot.
But we have not included that gas tax money in our projections, have we?
It's in to the extent that the money's been allocated to the city so far, that should be in the tip. It's in the tip.
So the dollars that have already been allocated by the state to either individual projects
So that
or
will change all the
cities.
projections that are.
Yeah, so those are in the draft RTIP. As additional projects get identified, then those would need to come in the future.
Okay.
However, if voters approve Prop 6 and SB1 goes away, then we would need to bring back an amendment to the RTIP to essentially strip out the SB1 dollars that are no longer going to be available.
Thank you, I was afraid of that.
Yes. And that would need to happen before the federal government would approve the
And of course,
RTIP.
that will affect all the projections that we were hearing from Ray and others.
Well, remember, this is state gas tax. What Ray was talking about was more on the sales tax side.
It was more Ray was talking about Transnet.
Correct.
This simply would affect, thank you for clarifying.
Sure.
Okay. So we have attachment 5 next, and this is covering the Transnet grant programs. So we have the Active Transportation Grant Program, we also call it the BIPED, Smart Growth, the Local Environmental Mitigation, and the Senior Mini Grant. So we're providing you information on the revenues that have been received. The total revenue received, column A, is the cumulative to date. And then we have it broken up, columns B and C, between how it's then used. So some of these programs are not necessarily used for grants. We do have these regional purposes. So for instance, the Active Transportation Grant Program has regional bike paths. And so those funds at 34, about 0.5 million, set aside for that purpose, whereas 19.5 is used for bike grants. And then you can see the grant expenditures to date and then the unspent commitment for the grants. And there is a slew of footnotes here that take you through the different cycles that are included in these numbers up above, as well as I think there might be some information on future cycle information. Any questions on this one? No? Okay, attachment 6. So this is our local street and road balances through the end of the fiscal year. And once again, we're providing the allocations. You can see the cumulative in the first column. Because it's the end of the fiscal year, column B is blank. We have no future estimates. It's the end of the year. And then we have some balances held. So we know what we're holding here at sandag. And then we reach out to the local jurisdictions and they tell us what they're holding to provide these cash balances overall. And we then look at, we take into account the programmed funds. what's in the RTIP that has not been used yet. At this point, which would be that column H, it's a little different when you're looking at this throughout the year versus the end of the year, because at the end of the year, I mean, there's nothing left to happen. It's June 30th. But we still keep it here. So I kind of don't really look at those columns too much because no future for the year. So what's important here? Column J. So the ITAC would like to see the local jurisdiction spending at a 75% rate by the end of the year. And we have highlighted 3 jurisdictions that did not meet that threshold. One of them just missed it, and that would be Coronado. So we have Carlsbad is at 48.3%. Coronado is at the 74.3%. And the third is Escondido is at 65.9%. And there were letters provided to you from each of the jurisdictions that provide an explanation and also a time frame of when they expect to get up to that 75% spending threshold. Any questions on it? Okay.
Oh, John has a question. Sorry.
Not on this one.
Oh, which one?
Okay.
No.
Talking about this. Are we through on this page?
Yes.
Okay. Did you look at appendix, did you discuss attachment 3, which is our ITALK budget?
Yes.
I have 2 quick questions
Yes.
on it. First question is, why is the annual fiscal audit increased so much from 2018 to 2019? And when?
Okay, so in fiscal year 18, we were in the final year of the audit contract, and we knew what the amount was. During the fiscal year, we had a request for proposal out because we needed to enter into agreement with the new audit contract. We did not know the amount that the contract would be, so we put an estimate together, kind of a high estimate. It is not that number. But at the time, we only had an estimate available to us. So that is what's budgeted. It's not necessarily what is under contract.
What is the range of under contract?
You know, I'm sorry, I failed to look that up.
That's what's projected, right, for, oh, no, we're talking about 19, sorry, yeah.
No, it's lower than that.
It is lower than that, but you'll see it at, is it the February meeting, I think.
My second question is, have we voted to reduce our allocation for 2019 budget? You know, we do that every year.
For 20.
Have we done that yet?
For FY19, you decided to keep your entire allocation, actually.
We decided to what?
You decided to keep the entire allocation for FY19.
Well, by this projection, we're going to go way over. I mean, we're going to have a lot of excess money, and perhaps we should look at that. If the committee agrees, I suggest we look at that at another meeting. According to this, we're going to have down at the bottom, we'll have almost 400,000, 387,000 left over, and if our 205,000 for the fiscal budget is say $100,000 high, that would mean that we'd have half a million that we're not that we should release for use in other areas. Am I correct?
If my memory's right, we had this discussion, and the decision was, well, this undoubtedly will wind up as a surplus. There's no reason to necessarily relinquish that surplus now, because 500,000 is 500,000, but it's an insignificant percentage of the other budgets.
Okay,
and we'll wait another year and see what.
Does staff agree? I mean, we sound pretty expensive. We've got a budget of $500,000 for what we do with our sandwiches and so forth.
One thing we just decided that it would carry over, and we'll just defer. We can defer in future years our allocation, so we'll just chip away at it. Was the discussion I recall.
As long as we're comfortable with it, that's fine. Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We better look at our transportation costs for gas mileage.
Hi.
Run on number 9, overview developments in financial markets.
Yeah, so thank you, and going to Greg again. Good to see you. Welcome to the committee. If you recall, when we met a couple weeks ago, I mentioned to you that on a quarterly basis we'll come to you, the committee, and describe the developments, an overview of the financial markets. It's just an informational item. Typically either Ray or Jim will talk about sales tax, economy, what's going on, and I'll talk about our debt program if there's been any changes. So with that, I guess
Sure.
Jim will take over the first piece.
We have a little market overview for you. You can see the equity market on the upper left hand remains near historic highs, has leveled off since the beginning of the year, but still year over year, significant gains in the equity market. The 10-year Treasury is off a little from annual highs. That's less important as a measure of interest rates than it is as investor confidence. As investor confidence grows, that number will decline. So you can see that investors are a little more comfortable than they were earlier this spring and summer, but a little less comfortable than they were last year at this time. And one of the reasons is the federal funds rate keeps going up. We have significant pressures in the economy which are leading the Fed to continue to raise rates. There are 2 more scheduled, very likely for this year. And one of the reasons that they are doing that is inflation is starting to exceed the target rate of 2%, the Fed's 2% target rate. This year-over-year number, July 2018, that's a little noisy, so it's probably in a longer term a little less than 2.9%, but it is starting to be over 2%, causing the Fed to increase the federal funds rate. The local economy, we're still doing very, very well with unemployment. We're down to 3.9%, which is better than or 3.5%, which is better than the state and the U.S. That's very close to what economists refer to as full employment, which is not so much everyone has a job, but that it's very difficult to get lower than this with the churn in the marketplace, people leaving jobs, people finding new jobs. One of the nice parts about unemployment remaining so low is that wages locally have risen 3.9% last year, which is higher than the national rate, which is about at 2.9%, and a long overdue, I would say, growth in wages. Typically when you see unemployment rates this low, it pushes up wages a little faster than we've seen. So we've been expecting this, and it's a heartening thing, particularly because housing prices in the bottom left continue to spike here in San Diego due to basically a supply shortage of housing. And now roughly only 25% of San Diego households could afford the median price household were they required to buy a house today. Or I guess we couldn't require that, but we could ask if they wanted to buy a house today. Another nice thing about the economy doing so well is taxable retail sales. For the first quarter, we're up about 7.4% over the first quarter of last year. We wouldn't expect a full year jump along those lines, but it's nice to see a very robust quarter compared to the first quarter of last year. As you can see, first quarters, it's the Christmas hangover, don't tend to do all that well, but it's nice to see a rise. Well, I wouldn't expect the Wayfair decision, which we spoke of earlier in the meeting, to impact our revenues quite yet. So it probably doesn't show up in this because that decision hadn't been rendered. And while California has not really made a decision about how they are going to go about seeking those revenues from the Wayfair decision, certain online retailers can decide that they will just comply with the Wayfair decision and send sales taxes for the ease of calculation to every jurisdiction where they sell. So that could be We would expect to start to see some creep up in revenues, but those won't show up for a little while. Anyway, the general consensus of the economy is it's very healthy. We're just waiting for some particular shoe to drop, which might cause us to slip. But as of right now, GDP growth, job growth, wage growth, all very positive. Wage growth.
Questions? Question. Is there any e-commerce dollars existing in that taxable retail sale?
There are, yeah. Any as of right before the Wayfair decision, if you had a physical presence in the jurisdiction in which you were doing business, you had to pay sales tax for that. So for eBay or Amazon, I think is probably a better example, they have fulfillment centers in California. So they would have to, if they were fulfilling that order, Amazon was themselves, they would have to pay sales tax. But if there was a third-party vendor that was fulfilling that for Amazon, that was based in Texas or North Dakota, et cetera, they wouldn't have to pay. So it was estimated that before Wayfair, we were collecting about half, sales tax on about half of e-commerce. So while it would be a nice kind of one-time jump from the Wayfair decision and kind of level the playing field between struggling brick and mortar and really growing e-commerce, it won't make a huge difference in our budget.
My recollection is that the wage growth number we're showing is substantially higher than the national number, if I'm remembering that.
It's a little bit higher. Yeah, well, 3.9 to 2.9 was the
I think it was
national
2.8, yeah.
for August, I believe.
So is there anything beneath the number there that you're aware of that give context to where that's coming from?
Sure, nothing. My impressions, not backed up by any scientific research I've done into this, would be two things. San Diego's job market is somewhat tighter than the national average.
And is there a particular sector that is we're seeing that?
We haven't seen breakouts of job of salary by type of job.
Okay.
But I can say that we have seen significant growth in jobs that are higher paying, such as in our innovation sector, our IT sector, professional sector. But the other side, I would also say that we did see increases in the state mandated minimum wage, which could also be bringing into this as well.
The other thing I was curious about is to what degree is San Diego kind of workforce influenced by immigration policies? I mean, I know that this is just purely anecdotal and maybe it was sort of sensational journalism, but I actually saw there was a piece not too long ago about a restaurant actually closing down because they claimed that they couldn't find staff.
I think the agricultural sector is impacted more than sectors here in San Diego, but we have two sectors that could be impacted. One would be our hospitality sector, which tends to rely on lower wage workers, and the other one is high-tech sector, which often seeks special visas for particularly skilled workers that have been cut back. So those are kind of two ends of the spectrum where immigration policy could provide a drag. Restricted immigration policy could provide a drag on our economy. But we're not as deeply affected as the agricultural sector in other parts of California, which are deeply dependent on migrant labor primarily, that has been cut back rather severely.
Thank you.
Just to move on, so the last time we presented to you was in May, and the big thing that happened last May was we had just completed the $537.5 million in short-term notes that we had closed in April. So since that time, from May till today, there's no changes. Our debt remains the same. I guess the only good thing is our maximum annual debt service number has gone up to 2.8. I think it was like 2.77. And that's just a matter of the sales tax growth. As that number gets higher, our maximum annual debt service gets bigger too. one of the things that we did do, we actually just closed on it yesterday, is our commercial paper requires that we have a liquidity bank behind it, just in case they can't remarket the paper for some reason. The bank needs to hold it. The Union Bank, who's been our bank for the last 5 years, came in and said that they're kind of getting out of the business, but if we did want to keep them, they're going to increase our rates by 50%. So we decided that that wasn't quite palatable to us, so we went out to an RFP. We got 9 banks to respond, and actually we were able to cut our fees by 50% from what they proposed. So now we're with Bank of America. We have a 3-year facility at 32 basis points, and Union Bank wanted 60 basis points. So we're in a good position with that too. Also, we have to do short-term ratings, like we do with our long-term bonds. We have to do short-term ratings, and we got the highest ratings, A1 and P1, by S&P and Moody's. So like our AAA ratings, we also have highest ratings that you can on our short-term program too. One of the things that kind of looking forward, in the next quarter we're going to look to do an RFP for our GANs, which is our Grant Anticipation Note. If you recall, the Mid-Coast project is a $2 billion project. $1 billion of it is coming from the Transnet side, from sales tax, from the TIFIA loan, from the short-term notes we issued. The other $1 billion is coming straight from the federal government. They're paying us $100 million per year. In fact, we just got the $100 million last week for 2019. Problem is the program is going to be built in the next 3 years, and we're going to be receiving the money over 10 years. So we've got 7 years left. So by doing a grant anticipation note, we're going to kind of be pulling some of those dollars forward. So we're going to be going and doing an RFP to select an investment banking firm that'll help us probably do that in about probably summer of next year is the time that we anticipate that we'll be doing the grant writing. So with that, I'll open for any questions you may have.
Thank you guys, appreciate it. Item number 10 is the Transit Meter Quarter and Bikeway Project Status Report.
Good morning. Today we will be presenting the fiscal year 18 Transnet Project Status Report for the major corridors and the Bikeway program. To give a brief history on these reports, in the 2015 triennial performance audit, auditors provided recommendations on how to best report performance data for the Transnet program. Based on those recommendations, staff began reporting program performance results in an annual comprehensive program status type format for the major corridors program and the Bikeway program. The Transnet project status reports were created by utilizing existing program data in the dashboard and other sandag tools. These reports provide an annual summary of performance metrics, such as projects delivered on schedule, projects delivered on budget, awarded construction value versus construction estimates, and miles and bikeway miles constructed. In February 2018, the Transit Project Office received approval from Italk on the data and the format of the reports. These reports will be updated on an annual basis and provide a summary of the previous fiscal year's performance. And with that, I'll briefly just kind of go through attachment 1. And so the first section provides a summary of the overall kind of the Transnet voter approved sales tax, a brief summary on the sales tax. The next section is related to leveraging of Transnet program funding. The Transnet ordinance assumes 50% of the net capital costs would be funded by federal, state, and other local sources. At the close of FY18, the Transnet funds represented 31% of the total $8.24 billion in program funding, which means Transnet return on investment is more than 2 to 1. The next section is the scheduled milestone attainment section, which represents the completion of project milestones in the approved FY budget, fiscal year budget. This report focuses on two specific milestones, the advertised milestone and the open to public milestone. The advertised milestone represents the completion of the design phase and the advertisement of the project's construction contract. Of the three projects we expected to advertise for construction in FY18, one was successfully advertised. The other two projects were rescheduled due to right-of-way delays, sandag board direction, and funding optimization strategies. The open to public milestone represents the opening of the constructed facility for its intended use, and all four projects that were planned to open in FY18 actually did open to public. The next section on the next page is the support to capital ratio metric, and this represents the proportion of support costs relative to the capital costs associated with delivering projects. These ratios are broken out by project size. So for projects 30 million or less, we currently have a 47% support to capital ratio. For projects 30 to 100%, it's 52%, and for projects over 100 million, it's 41%. The next section, which is the construction contract section, this section demonstrates our engineer's estimate versus awarded construction contract performance. We awarded 3 design, bid, build construction contracts in fiscal year 18, and the awarded values were 2% under the engineer's estimates. Next section is the total budget variance. This represents the pre-award project budget versus the project final cost at completion. We closed out two CIPs in fiscal year 18, and the final cost of completion exceeded the pre-construction budget by 4%. And the final section here is the construction budget variance. So similar to the previous section, but this just focuses primarily on the construction cost for the project. And again, we closed out 2 projects for fiscal year 18, and the final cost at completion exceeded the pre-construction cost by 1%. Any questions for the major quarter?
I've got one, and this question itself will reveal my total lack of expertise on the subject. But I'm just curious in the support to capital ratio. Intuitively, I would have expected more kind of sort of economy of scale, for lack of a better word. But it seems like the support to capital ratio doesn't meaningfully change with bigger projects. I'm just curious about that. Maybe this is an area where my intuition makes, is just not applicable, but.
Yeah, your intuition is right on the money. And this is something that I personally monitor throughout my whole career, and it's as frustrating as could be that you can't keep this down. Part of the reason is San Diego has become more and more urbanized, and so the expectation of the public is so different than it was a generation ago as far as outreach go and informing of construction and tolerance for closing lanes on a highway, or disruptions to the coastal rail corridor or the trolley system. That all requires staff support. And so as much as we try to, in addition to regulation, I think we had a conversation here a few months ago where we talked about just the stormwater regulations add a lot to that support cost just because of all the monitoring we have to do, and the labor compliance monitoring and things like that adds a lot to the support cost. But one of the things that we've come to realize is if you look at a huge program of projects, you will definitely see when you're comparing similar projects, the larger the project in a similar type of atmosphere, the lower the support cost will be. Because if you're building a big bridge, it doesn't really cost that many more dollars. It doesn't cost that much more support dollars to build that bridge as opposed to a bunch of little piecemeal work at the same location. But what we find on things like South Bay Bus Rapid Transit, which goes right down the middle of East Palomar Street in the city of Chula Vista, that requires just so much support and outreach to the community that we actually had to put a separate resident engineer on for construction on every single one of those segments, just because they spend a good decent amount of their time working with the community on things like that. There's a grade school out there, and there's condos that are built right up against the bridges and things like that. And so it's that type of work. But I got to tell you, it's frustrating, and we try as hard as can be to keep those numbers down. And if I am open to any ideas on how to do it better.
I don't have any suggestion. Like I said, it's just, you somehow intuitively think there'd be more economy of scale, but I hear what you're saying, so thanks for the...
And if you looked at a dozen similar type of jobs out in the middle, let's say in the middle of nowhere, or in an urban core, and you vary by size, you would likely find that.
Yeah, got it.
But your definition of support is extremely broad, and is not engineering the biggest component?
It's engineering, it's construction management, it's right-of-way support. So the support you need to go out and buy a parcel. When you buy parcels,
I was assuming that engineering would be a very sizable portion.
Yes,
of
absolutely.
Support, and engineering normally doesn't lend itself to any economy of scale.
Engineers are also not procured based on any best value. They're procured or on a cost basis. They're procured per the Federal Brooks Act, that you cannot consider cost into the selection.
Used to be a bigger component. Now, proportionally, it's dropped.
Thanks.
So with that, we're going to go to the next attachment, which is the bikeway project status report, and Chelsea's going to walk through that.
So for the bikeway program report, it displays the same metrics as the major corridors report, with the exception of these top two sections that you'll see. So we'll begin with bikeway miles by phase. So out of the 77 miles planned for the program, 70.3 miles have been programmed as of the end of FY18. So this graphic kind of displays the breakdown of the mileage between the various project delivery stages. So environmental, design, under construction, and open to public. And so this kind of reflects where each of those miles was as of the end of FY18. And then to the right of that, bikeway miles delivered by fiscal year, this displays how many bike miles will be completed or open for public use by the end of each fiscal year. So through the end of FY18, 7.5 miles have been completed, and we've noted those specific projects below the graphic. And you'll kind of see that, looking at fiscal year 20 through fiscal year 2022, we anticipate a huge portion of those projects to be completed. And then moving down, again to the schedule milestone attainment section, looking at projects advertised for fiscal year 18, we were able to, we advertised 1 out of the 7 planned milestones, and the 6 other milestones have been rescheduled for FY19 or FY20. And so the causes for delay for these projects range from right-of-way negotiations, project redesign, scope redesign, as well as additional community outreach that was needed. So while we do see the room for improvement in meeting that advertised milestone, similar to the Major Corridors program, we did achieve 100% of the open to public milestones in opening the SR15 commuter bikeway and Bayshore bikeway segments 4 and 5. And moving on to the second page of this report, leveraging Transnet program funding. So for fiscal year 18, Transnet funds represented 64% of the overall funding for the bikeway program, with 36% of the funding being leveraged from federal, local, or state sources. So kind of differing from the Major Corridors program, where there is the 1-to-1 match requirement within the ordinance, there isn't the same requirement for the bikeway program, so that's why you see these differ somewhat, but still a great achievement to leverage the 36% of those funds. And then moving down to the support to capital ratio section, we have also separated the data based on the total project budget. So for those projects less than $10 million, we have seen a pretty significant increase in the support to capital ratio to 70% for this fiscal year. And for those projects $10 million or more, a slight increase to 48%.
Let me add something here, because I think it relates to support to capital ratio and some of our milestone challenges that we had, where we show we've only advertised 1 of 7. And taking a look at this from a management perspective, what we found is a couple things. Is a lot of our portfolio of bike projects that we're trying to do are on urban streets in the city of San Diego. So I think Jim talked about just kind of the community outreach and working, and the community planning groups and residents adjacent to these projects are very involved, when it impacts parking, when it impacts how they're going to get access. So I'd say the level of community involvement is much higher than we've seen on even things like Post. So that's sort of the one thing. The other thing we found that why we were kind of spending a lot of time in the process and kind of not making as much progress is the work with the City of San Diego teams themselves. We have to submit these things to their DSD, their Development Services Department, to get it reviewed. And there were a lot of inefficiencies there, where what we assumed to be, maybe a 3 to 6 month process, we're taking 6 months to a year. So since then, I've helped intervene. We've brought our management team to actually meet with their management to go, hey, we all share the same goal of improving these things, providing these new bike lanes and sidewalks and pedestrian enhancements. How can we work together to really minimize those processes? Some of the comments, we were getting 2, 3, or 4 rounds of comments on some things that really shouldn't occur. And that's where a lot of the churn and I think the costs come in. So since then, they've put kind of their HIT team on it. We have our staff. We've put our consultant staff. So we were finding, for example, on many of these bike projects where some of their staff, their review staff were saying, well, this is not a standard thing. I've never seen this before. So we actually sat down and put together a booklet of things like, hey, this is where you already have it in your city, or this is where it's an acceptable standard per this organization, or per FHWA or whatever, to really help speed through the review process. So while we didn't necessarily hit the mark for FY18, I'm really hopeful that some of these things we're kind of turning the corner, and you'll see some better results. To see the capitals, the support ratios going down, and kind of see the timelines, the milestones that we're tracking and intending to hit. When we develop the budget to do that, we'll actually hit more and more of those. But this is something I think for you guys to keep a watch on, and kind of ask us the questions.
So that I understand this, on a $10 million project, the support costs are $4.8 million. Is that what you're saying? Do I understand that?
On
projects $10 million or more, the support costs represent 48% of the overall capital.
4.8 million. Am I correct? Am I multiplying it right?
Well, this could include, there could be some projects that are $20 million, $25 million, so it's not limited to just the $10 million mark.
For a $100 million project, almost 50% of that goes to what you call support, and the other 50% are hard costs, construction costs. Is that right?
And another thing to note is that we don't include right-of-way capital expenditures in this report, or right-of-way capital costs or right-of-way support costs.
Those land costs are they're part of support costs or not?
Yes. No, it's not. We exclude it. Otherwise, the denominator would increase, and it would make the support to capital ratio a lot less. So we're just really looking at the other support elements to a project as well, and versus the actual capital cost of construction.
But also to address we don't yet have a $100 million bike project.
Sure. Well, I was going back to the first half before. No, I understand. Right. But it's still, you're saying on a $100 million or more project, construction.
Right. So that would be for a larger project, like
50%, almost 50% of that goes to support.
That's
correct. The other 50% are the hard costs.
That's correct.
It seems back to my engineering. You don't have hard costs unless you have engineering. So that's.
But engineering is supposed to be 6%.
Well, it's not 6 probably, but
they're less than that. They're good guys. But I mean, still, that's fun. That's
the order of magnitude here in the right. Yeah.
Good gosh.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding, Kim, part of what you had said, and I guess inevitably this will seem a little bit like pointing fingers. You were describing, if I'm hearing you correctly, some meaningful inefficiencies at the city of San Diego in terms of getting a lot of the bikeway stuff actually done, because at least with regard to the public, I mean, I think Sandag has taken a pretty big hit on lack of progress here, and so
we've taken a hit. I mean, if you recall, we actually, for this program, won the Golden Fleece Award from the Taxpayer
Right,
Association. And the questions were, how much outreach is too much outreach? That was one criticism, right? Part of it is we're building these things in people's neighborhoods and their communities. So we are trying to be mindful of that. But yeah, there were some process things that also occurred.
Right. Yeah, I'm not talking about the citizens.
Yeah.
When I say City of San Diego, I'm talking about the administration of City of San Diego. And
They frankly, that same process, like the process that the city's capital projects group will have a project that maybe is using transit funds. They'll go through their development services department and have to get approval from another department and go through a whole other, they do it to themselves the same as the way they do it to Sandag. And it's, they are, you know, yeah.
well, one thing that I'm just kind of curious about, and I know in the past Jonathan has been, you know, kind of at the forefront of this battle with the City of San Diego's unspent funds vis-a-vis street and road, but you know, maybe it goes back, you know, 2-3 years that they had made a big thing about how that they had been staffing up so that they would now be better able to more efficiently be able to administer more projects. I mean, is that still part of what's going on, or are there just more complicated factors that?
Yeah, I think there's always staffing issues. I think we're on our end, we're trying to take responsibility and be mindful. You know, perhaps our original schedules on how quickly we could get through their development services, given that they do have a whole portfolio of things, not just our projects, but private projects, developer projects, their own projects. And so we've tried to true up in our more recent schedule, hey, what's a realistic time frame for us to expect them to finish their first level review, and if we need a second level review, what that would take. So that's one thing on our scheduling side. On their end, it really is about what's the understanding of these projects that are going through the city. Oftentimes we were, I'd say, treated as if we were some developer somewhere. We're in fact building the capital projects that are in their either active transportation plans or that help them meet their climate action plan. So there was a little bit of disconnect there where we haven't, and it's not to say that we don't have good relationship with the city, because when I look, what I've told them is like, when I look at Mid-Coast, you guys understand how important that project, that trolley extension is to the fabric of your city, not, you know, much less the region. And they work to take hurdles and you know, out of the way for us there. We need to achieve that same
responsiveness. They're not making this a priority
for bike projects like we do for our $2 billion projects, because fundamentally we're building out what they say they need in their own general plans and circulation elements. So it's a, you know, it's a learning experience we're going through, but like I said, I'm very hopeful. Linda Culpier of our team, who you know runs the bike program section, she and her team have been working, you know, hard and diligently. You know, it's about building relationships and making these processes work better, not just for us, not just for the city, but like for the taxpayers, the people we're trying to build these things for.
But is that 70%, you're saying that that's just it's costing you more because of all the extra meetings, extra time, extra staffing?
I don't know the real specific projects in the 10 million other, but yeah, there's definitely some of that there. I'd say there's some churn that then is reflected in those costs for the last fiscal year. I'm hoping and expecting that those numbers are going to go down as we get.
Where do you think they should be?
Where
do you think that number should be?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, they're going to be higher than for some of our big projects, because by nature these active transportation and sidewalks are smaller scale projects, right? So you're still going to need a resident engineer. You're still going to need, you know, you still have like a communications person that helps with that. I don't know the right number. It's lower than 7.
Shouldn't that cost go down? I mean, if your project cost is $1 million, the engineer should not be, you know, on a percentage basis, even if it's 10% of the cost or whatever. Shouldn't it be bring down that number precipitously? I mean, it seems that the fixed cost of the engineering or the what you call the consulting costs would not change that much, but I'm trying to figure out what's the cost that's just changing so much. But you've got this really huge.
It's time, right?
I think it's time. It's time.
Is it time, a staffing time? And, you know,
because the longer the project takes, the more of those overhead costs kind of get into that.
Right, because it's not the engineering. The engineering is a fixed cost. I mean, it costs you to get that process, or is it the engineering time to go back and forth and keep?
Yes, I would say some of it's engineering time to develop plans and then try to respond one way. So I think there is time and redo effort, I think, in some of these costs that we're seeing.
Well, is it true to say that in fiscal year 2018, Sandag received $294 million of Transnet funds, and 40% of that went for support costs?
No.
But you say that everything we've awarded, or the way I read, what am I missing? You say that 40% of
So this is support costs in relation to the capital cost. So it's a ratio between the two, not the total budget. And we don't include every aspect of the project in the support to capital ratio. Again, we're excluding right-of-way cost, vehicle cost, and project contingency cost in this ratio. Those can be pretty significant portions of a project, and they are significant portions of the project. This is just support costs in relation to capital construction costs.
Is there a detailed list of what you're excluding in here under a
It's listed
footnote?
in the note there. Support to capital ratio. In addition, we're excluding right-of-way support, right-of-way capital vehicles, and project contingency are admitted in this calculation.
But I mean,
You mean with dollars attached to it?
well,
For
just in
specific
general,
projects, or?
even how we're going back up. He was going back up to just the overall process up here.
Yeah, the overall, I'm not trying to belabor this because we're getting late. You know, looking at your very first number, support to capital ratio is 47, 52, 41, right around 40 to 50%. Well, we've expended, I presume, $294 million roughly. And are you saying that 40 to 50% of that is support costs?
I think the 294 million, are you speaking about total overall?
Total
Sales
overall.
tax revenues, but this is just the major capital portion, which is just that 38% of the overall pot, and then the bikeway program, it doesn't include, right, the other sub-programs, I think. Does that help
If I'm
answer?
understanding it, the support cost to acquire land is included in support costs, but the cost of the land acquisition is not included in the denominator.
No, neither of them.
No, neither are.
Huh?
Right-of-way support is not included.
And the support of not.
Part of the reason is that the value of land can be so widely varying, and it doesn't really, the cost of the land doesn't really tell you how efficient you're delivering a project. What this is trying to say is how much does it cost you in engineering and other support functions versus just the construction costs. That's the type of efficiency that we're looking at.
That 40% number is good. Jonathan is just incorrect in applying it to the total budget. But his point is still valid for the hard,
right.
The concrete, we're spending 40%.
Right, and this is a measure that's trying to get at how efficient or not are we in trying to complete a project, the construction portion of it.
You're not going to solve it today. I won't say anything more about it.
I have a question on something that's not Jim's fault, though. I'm curious, Kim, hearing your comments on the complexity of actually just getting this stuff done, and again, given that there's been some public, at least in some quarters, lack of patience about this sort of stuff. What's the confidence level with regard to the miles to be delivered in fiscal 19 and 20 at this point? Is there reasonable forward visibility on project completion for the next year or two?
We learn a lot each year, and just like Kim mentioned, some of those reasons, maybe we were overly optimistic at the time we would take over the city of San Diego, for example. We're building in a little bit more time at the same time that we're trying to work with the city and within that framework and make some changes. So I think we feel pretty confident those next few years. We have 24 projects in our program right now. in some form of design. And so that schedule through those fiscal years reflects where all those projects are right now. So as we learn more, we put that into our annual schedule and budgeting processes. We feel fairly confident.
And just in terms of the nature of these projects and the degree to which you do have forward visibility, so fiscal 19, excuse me, we're looking at 5-something miles. At this point, would you have pretty good clarity that yes, we're going to get that 5 miles done, or we're going to get substantially all of that 5 miles done, as opposed to, you know, there just isn't that much visibility even just within the current fiscal year? Or?
Yeah, I do. Those next couple of years in particular, those are projects that are either starting into construction and maybe finished next year, or final design, or getting through the city process and so forth. If where we want to watch is those later years, that's where most of our programs coming up. Those are projects right now just maybe entering final design and not over to the city yet, so we want to watch those really closely. That's why I'm saying the lessons learned that we're getting now will definitely be applying to those.
Cool, thank you.
Just to briefly kind of touch on the last couple sections, so I think we left off on construction contracts. So this is, as Lamont mentioned, limited to construction contracts awarded through a traditional design bid build process. So there is no new data for the bikeway program in FY18 because there were no traditional design bid build contracts awarded. However, there was one construction manager general contractor contract awarded, and this is kind of the process where the contractor acts as a consultant during the design process and can offer constructability and pricing feedback on design options. So there was one contract awarded, but it doesn't reflect the design bid build process, so that's why you don't see any new data there. And then in terms of the last two sections, as you can kind of see from the graphic of kind of where all the bikeway miles are at, kind of in the earlier stages of the process, we didn't have any bikeway projects completely close out this fiscal year, so there's no new data reflected within FY18 as well. So that concludes our report. I'd be happy to take any other questions you may have.
Thank you.
Thank you guys very much. So I think with that, we have reached the end of our agenda. The next meeting is scheduled for October 10th. Ryan here. And Ariana, if you can or cannot make it, that'd be great. And does anybody want to move adjournment?
I second it.
All those in favor? Thank you.